Beneath the blistering Egyptian sun, the Valley of the Kings lay silent, a kingdom of the dead, veiled in wind and sand. The cliffs, carved by millennia, watched over the tombs of vanished monarchs whose names were once spoken like thunder. In the autumn of 1922, the valley was not empty. A small caravan of men and donkeys trudged through the dust, led by a lean, weather-beaten Englishman with a restless glint in his eyes, Howard Carter. For 6 long years, he had been searching these barren slopes for a single doorway that refused to be found, the lost tomb of a forgotten boy-king named Tutankhamun. The dig had become a kind of madness. Funds were running dry. Lord Carnarvon, his patron, had already threatened to end the project. The desert had swallowed every promise of discovery, offering only sun, silence, and disappointment. Yet that morning something felt different. The workers' picks struck a layer of limestone beneath the sand, and the sound rang out with a hollow echo. Not rock, but steps. Carter's heart seized. He brushed away the dust with trembling hands. One step led to another, and then another, descending into the earth like the spine of a secret long buried. The men worked feverishly until they reached a sealed doorway plastered with ancient symbols. The stamp was unmistakable, the royal seal of the necropolis. Carter froze. Could this be it? For centuries, thieves had stripped every royal tomb, leaving only empty chambers and curses carved into broken walls. But this seal was intact, untouched. The air itself seemed to shiver. Carter felt, for the first time in his life, afraid to breathe. He ordered the passage cleared, torches lit. The smell of dust and old stone filled their lungs. Lord Carnarvon arrived days later, anxious and pale from illness but eager for glory. Together, they stood before the door, the flickering light trembling across its surface. Carter made a small hole and slid a candle through the opening. Warm air, sealed for more than 3,000 years, brushed against his face. The wax flame fluttered, illuminating gold, ivory, and shapes that glowed like dreams. Carnarvon's voice broke the silence. "Can you see anything?" Carter, unable to tear his eyes away, whispered, "Yes, wonderful things." But wonder was not the only thing that escaped that chamber. Within days, rumors began to stir among the workers. Strange accidents, sudden sickness, a cobra, the ancient symbol of royal protection, slithering into Carter's house and devouring his pet canary. The locals murmured that the pharaoh had awoken, angered by the violation of his eternal rest. Carter laughed it off, though he noticed that the men began to avert their eyes when he passed. The valley, once filled with eager labor, grew uneasy. Even the wind seemed to carry whispers. When the sealed door was finally breached and the tomb revealed in all its splendor, chariots, statues, jewelry, the unbroken sarcophagus of Tutankhamun, the world erupted in awe. Reporters arrived from every continent. The discovery was hailed as the greatest archaeological triumph of the modern age. Yet amid the triumph, an ancient warning glimmered faintly on a small clay tablet found near the entrance. "Death shall come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of the king." The inscription was dismissed as coincidence, one of many generic curses common to tomb lore. But the words clung to the imagination. They lingered in the press reports, in hushed conversations, in the shadowed corners of Cairo cafes. Egypt had always been a land where myth and life intertwined, and in that fragile balance, a story was waiting to be born. Only weeks later, Lord Carnarvon fell ill. A mosquito bite on his cheek grew infected. Within days, he was delirious. At midnight, as the city's lights flickered, the power in his hotel abruptly failed. In the darkness, his final breath rattled through the room. At that exact moment, witnesses claimed his dog back in England howled once, then collapsed and died. Newspapers the next morning screamed headlines of vengeance from beyond the grave. The curse of the pharaohs had begun. Carter refused to believe it. He returned to the tomb, methodical and composed, cataloging every object, sealing every discovery in neat boxes. But others whispered that something in him had changed. He no longer lingered near the entrance. He worked in silence, often at night, refusing to speak of Carnarvon. The Egyptian workers, terrified, began to leave. Rumors spread like wildfire, of unexplained noises in the tomb, of sudden drafts of cold air, of eyes gleaming from the dark beyond the torchlight. In the cafés of Cairo and the parlors of London, mystics and journalists alike fed the growing hysteria. Was this truly divine retribution? Had modern science, in its arrogance, trespassed on a sacred realm it could not understand? Every mysterious death that followed, a financier's collapse, a secretary's sudden illness, an early visitor's freak accident, became another verse in the legend. Egypt, long silent under the sand, was now speaking in the language of fear. And yet beneath that fear was something else, fascination. The more the curse frightened, the more the world was drawn to it. Tutankhamun's name, once forgotten for 3,000 years, now echoed in every newspaper, every home. What had been meant as a resting place had become a spectacle. The boy king, dead at 19, was suddenly immortal again, his spirit resurrected through both wonder and dread. As Carter stood once more before the golden shrine, the air around him heavy with the scent of resin and time, he could not have known that this discovery would blur forever the line between history and myth. The door he opened that day did not merely lead to a tomb, it led into humanity's oldest fear, that the past, once disturbed, can still reach out to claim the living. In the dim torchlight, the glittering treasures seemed to flicker with life, the painted eyes of the statues watching, unblinking. Somewhere in the shadows, the promise of the curse waited patiently, not as a spell or superstition, but as a story that would never die. And as the dust settled on that sacred threshold, one question hung in the air like the desert wind. What if the ancient warning was not a threat, but a truth, that death itself defends its secrets? Long before the dust of the Valley of the Kings settled on Howard Carter's boots, long before the curse began to whisper through the modern world, there was only a boy frail, uncertain, and burdened with the weight of eternity. Tutankhamun was not born into glory. He was born into chaos. Egypt, once radiant under the heretical sun of Akhenaten, his father, or perhaps his brother, was divided. The old gods had been overthrown in favor of a single deity. Aten, the sun disk, and the great temples of Ammonius had been silenced. Priests were scattered, monuments defaced, faith itself broken. Into that fractured world came the child who would one day be called the living image of Ammonius. He was barely 9 years old when he ascended the throne, a small figure seated on a golden chair too large for his frame. The crown, a heavy coil of gold and lapis, pressed down upon his fragile skull. His spine was curved, his legs weak from a congenital deformity. Ancient depictions show him leaning on a staff, his body supported by others. Yet the court presented him as divine perfection, a god reborn to heal the land. The irony was painful. Egypt's new savior could scarcely stand on his own. His childhood unfolded not in play but in ritual. Every breath he took was governed by ceremony. The incense, the chants, the endless processions through halls of stone and light. Behind him moved the regents who truly ruled. Powerful courtiers like Ai and Horemheb, men of ambition cloaked in loyalty. They spoke through the boy, guiding his decrees, shaping his every act to restore the old order. The temples reopened, the priests returned, and the name of Ammonius was spoken once again. The golden statues of Aten were quietly dismantled, their heresy buried beneath the desert. But Tutankhamun was not merely a puppet. Within the fragile body of the boy king stirred a flicker of curiosity, of innocence untouched by politics. He was fascinated by creation, by the sacred carvings that told stories of gods and men, by the delicate artistry of the craftsmen who worked in his name. He ordered gifts for the temples, repairs for the shrines his father had destroyed. In the fragile peace of his short reign, Egypt began to breathe again. Yet even then, death shadowed him like a patient scribe. The palace walls could not hide the reality of his failing health. The physicians whispered of infections, of bone disease, of congenital curses passed down through the royal bloodline. His marriage to Ankhesenamun, the daughter of Akhenaten and his own half-sister, brought no joy. She bore him 2 daughters, both stillborn. Their tiny mummies would one day be found beside him, wrapped in linen, as if the gods had refused to give the young couple even the solace of legacy. Tutankhamun was not yet 20 when his body began to betray him completely. In the 12th year of his reign, during a ceremonial hunt, the king fell from his chariot. The broken leg that resulted may have festered. Some say he was struck in the head. Others whisper of assassination, a palace conspiracy to remove the boy before he came of age and began to think for himself. Whatever the truth, the divine child of Egypt met a mortal end, gasping for air as the desert winds whispered outside the palace walls. His death was not a grand affair. It was quiet, uncertain, and swift. The priests moved quickly. No one wanted another crisis, another period of divine silence. The body was prepared in haste, wrapped in layers of linen, encased in resins, placed in nested coffins of wood and gold. His burial chamber was small, perhaps never meant for a pharaoh at all, suggesting that his death was unexpected. The walls were painted with scenes of his journey into the afterlife, but the artistry was rushed. The colors were bright but uneven, the lines shaky. Egypt had buried many kings before, but never one so young, so untested, so fragile. In death, however, Tutankhamun achieved what he never could in life: permanence. The tomb, hidden beneath debris from earlier excavations, was forgotten. Larger tombs around it were plundered, stripped, and desecrated, but his resting place remained sealed, a tiny pocket of time preserved by accident. The priest's hurried work became a miracle of concealment. For more than 3,000 years, while empires rose and fell, while languages were born and died, the boy king slept undisturbed beneath a ceiling painted with stars. Imagine that silence. The unbroken dark, the faint scent of resin trapped in the air, the stillness of the golden mask resting upon his face. Around him lay treasures that no living eyes would see again for millennia. Chariots gleaming with gold leaf, statuettes of gods, furniture, jewelry, and the ceremonial dagger forged from meteoric iron, a gift from the heavens themselves. Everything the pharaoh might need in eternity waited patiently in the shadows. Time itself seemed to guard him. And yet, if the ancient Egyptians were right, Tutankhamun was not entirely asleep. In their faith, death was not an ending but a journey, a long passage through the underworld. The dead king's soul, the Ka, wandered among the stars, sustained by offerings and remembrance. To disturb his tomb was to disturb that journey, to pull him back into the realm of the living, confused and vengeful. The warning inscribed upon so many tombs was not superstition. It was a plea: let me rest. Do not awaken what has passed. The irony, of course, is that the world would not let him rest. 3,000 years later, his name would once again be spoken, not as a prayer but as a headline. A child king who had lived in the shadow of others became the most famous pharaoh in history. His fragile bones would be x-rayed, his skull measured, his lineage dissected. His death would be debated in laboratories and museums, his treasures displayed under cold electric lights. Tutankhamun, once hidden from time, was reborn into it. And yet, even amid the glitter of discovery, something mournful remains. The golden mask, its calm expression serene, conceals the face of a boy who never grew old, who never ruled in truth, who was used by gods and men alike. Beneath that beauty lies tragedy, the quiet tragedy of a child crushed beneath the weight of a civilization's belief in immortality. It is easy to forget that the so-called curse began with him, with his loneliness, his vulnerability, his unfinished story. When Carter brushed away the dust and the world gasped at the sight of the golden coffin, they were not only uncovering a king, they were disturbing a child's dream of peace. Perhaps that is why the myth of the curse resonates so deeply. It is not merely fear of divine punishment. It is guilt, collective and ancient, for awakening what should have been left undisturbed. The boy in the golden mask was never meant to haunt the living, but once his eyes met the modern world, he could never close them again. For centuries after Tutankhamun was laid to rest, his name faded into the shadows of history. Dynasties rose and fell, temples crumbled, and new pharaohs carved their own stories into stone. The boy king became a ghost even among ghosts, erased not by malice, but by time itself. His modest tomb lay beneath a heap of limestone debris left by the later construction of Ramses VI's burial chamber. The entrance disappeared beneath the desert, sealed under layers of rubble, wind, and forgetfulness. In a valley filled with grand monuments and glittering treasures, his small, unassuming grave was all but invisible, and that was his salvation. For the tomb robbers who prowled the necropolis in the centuries that followed, only visibility mattered. They broke into the resting places of mighty kings, pried gems from their eyes, melted gold from their coffins, and tore linen from mummified flesh. The afterlife, for many pharaohs, was a violated dream. Yet Tutankhamun's tomb remained untouched, its entrance buried too deep for greed to find. It was as if the desert itself had decided to protect the forgotten child. While other tombs were stripped bare, his slept beneath the sand, a small miracle of concealment. Generations passed. The valley was abandoned, reclaimed by silence. Even the memory of where Tutankhamun lay was lost. Ancient lists of royal burials omitted his name. The priests who had buried him in haste could not have known that, by choosing such a modest site, they had hidden him from thieves and from history itself. The boy who could not live long enough to make a mark in life was being prepared, unwittingly, for immortality in death. The sands of the Valley of the Kings are treacherous storytellers. Every gust reshapes the land, covering and uncovering fragments of the past. Now and then, an ancient shard or the edge of a carving would appear in the sunlight, teasing explorers who came to Egypt seeking fame or fortune. By the 19th century, the Age of Empire had rekindled the Western fascination with Egypt. Men armed with pickaxes, brushes, and arrogance arrived to claim the secrets of the pharaohs. They dug, they plundered, they sold relics to museums and collectors who displayed them like trophies of conquest. By the time Howard Carter entered the scene in the early 1900s, the Valley of the Kings had been almost completely mapped and excavated. Most scholars believed it held no more secrets. The tombs of great pharaohs, Ramses, Seti, Thutmose, had been unearthed and catalogued. Egypt's golden age seemed fully exhumed. But one name still lingered in the lists: Tutankhamun. A king with no known tomb, no glory, no legacy. The absence was strange, unsettling. It was as if the sands were deliberately withholding something. Carter was not a man to ignore mysteries. Trained as an artist, he had begun his career sketching ruins for other archaeologists before becoming a meticulous excavator in his own right. He believed that the tomb of Tutankhamun must exist somewhere, hidden, overlooked, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. Yet his contemporaries mocked him. The valley, they said, was exhausted. There was nothing left but dust. But Carter's instincts told him otherwise. He imagined the forgotten pharaoh lying beneath their very feet, untouched. His theory was bold but logical. If the tomb of Ramses VI was built later, its workmen might have dumped the debris from their construction directly over an earlier tomb entrance. The rubble would have hidden it completely. So Carter began to dig, slowly, methodically, inch by inch, near the base of the cliff where the valley narrowed. It was backbreaking work under the punishing sun. Year after year, his workers sifted through rubble and stone, finding nothing but fragments. A piece of pottery here, a chip of gold leaf there. Each discovery, however trivial, was a whisper that told him he was close. His patron, Lord Carnarvon, grew restless. The money was running out and public interest was fading. The newspapers wanted headlines, not patience. By 1922, after 6 fruitless seasons, Carnarvon announced that he would fund only one final excavation. Carter, haunted by the thought of failure, begged for one more chance. He returned to the same patch of ground he had dug before, convinced that the answer lay there, and he was right. In early November, one of his workers struck a hard edge beneath the sand. Carter knelt and brushed away the dust with his hands. It was the top of a carved step, the first of many leading downward. He ordered the team to clear it carefully, revealing a staircase descending into the earth. At the base was a sealed doorway. The plaster bore the impression of an ancient necropolis seal, a jackal watching over 9 bound captives, the symbol of royal protection. Carter's pulse raced. For centuries, no one had seen this mark. They covered the entrance and sent word to Lord Carnarvon in England. Days later, the two men stood together in the heat of the valley, staring at that sealed threshold. Carter noted how strange it felt to look upon something that had not been seen by human eyes for over 3 millennia. The stillness was almost alive. The air was heavy, unmoving, as if holding its breath. Beneath their feet, within that small chamber, the world's most intact royal tomb waited in perfect darkness. What Carter could not know then was that this discovery would be unlike any other. Most tombs, once opened, yielded plundered remains, fragments of gold, shattered sarcophagi, looted mummies. But Tutankhamun's was whole. The boy's obscurity had protected him better than armies of guards. His insignificance in life had become his armor in death. The forgotten pharaoh had, by accident or destiny, achieved what every ruler of Egypt desired: eternal preservation. In a sense, Tutankhamun's tomb was not lost at all. It was hidden by design, the perfect act of concealment woven by time itself. Every fallen stone, every gust of desert wind, had conspired to guard him. The hands that had buried him hurriedly, afraid and uncertain, had unknowingly preserved a masterpiece of history. It was as though Egypt's gods had intervened, ensuring that one day, when humanity had forgotten reverence, the ancient world would rise again to remind them. When the final grains of sand were swept away and the doorway stood exposed, the silence of the tomb seemed to hum with warning. The ancient Egyptians believed that names have power, that to speak the name of the dead was to make them live again. And so, in 1922, when Howard Carter read the hieroglyphs of Tutankhamun, Lord of the Two Lands, he unknowingly called the boy back into the world. That single act, the uncovering of a forgotten name, would change everything. Within weeks, the curse would awaken. The dead would stir in story and in fear, and the modern world would learn that some silences should never be broken. Howard Carter was not born into privilege, nor into the polished academic circles that ruled archaeology in his time. He was the son of an English painter from Norfolk, quiet, introverted, and far from the kind of man the world expected to change history. From a young age, he was fascinated not by books but by drawings of ancient things, by lines that could resurrect lost worlds. At 17, with no formal education, he was sent to Egypt as an artist to sketch temple reliefs for other archaeologists. The heat, the light, the overwhelming silence of the desert, it all captivated him. In that silence he found purpose. While others saw ruins, he saw voices waiting to be heard again. By the turn of the century, he had earned a reputation for being precise, stubborn, and utterly consumed by his work. He did not socialize easily. He was brusque, often rude, and suspicious of authority. His peers saw an outsider, but those who knew him closely saw something rarer: devotion. Egypt became his obsession, its sand his home. He learned to read hieroglyphs by lamplight, studied the smallest fragments with reverence, and treated every find as sacred. Yet despite his skill, the institutions of British archaeology treated him as expendable, a hired hand, not a scholar. It was his dismissal from the Egyptian Antiquities Service after a dispute with French officials that hardened him. He retreated from excavation for years, painting and taking odd jobs. But he never forgot his dream, to find something no one else had found. When he met George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, fate seemed to intervene. Carnarvon, a wealthy English nobleman with a taste for adventure, had been funding digs in Egypt as a fashionable pastime. He was charismatic, impulsive, and, crucially, willing to spend. Carter's rigor complemented his patron's enthusiasm. Together, they formed one of the strangest partnerships in the history of discovery, one ruled by tension, necessity, and mutual ambition. Their first years together were frustrating. They excavated several sites, unearthing broken statues, empty chambers, and the faint remnants of what had already been looted centuries before. The valley had been stripped bare. Every promising lead dissolved into disappointment. Each year, Carnarvon's patience waned, and each year Carter's obsession deepened. He grew gaunt from the sun, his notebooks filled with sketches of walls that led nowhere. Yet the absence of results only sharpened his conviction. Somewhere beneath the sands of Thebes, he believed, Tutankhamun still waited. Carter's life became one of ritual and repetition. The early morning call of laborers, the rhythmic scrape of metal against rock, the swirling dust that clung to his clothes and lungs. The desert is a cruel teacher. It rewards endurance, not brilliance. But Carter endured. He returned to the same areas again and again, refining his maps, marking out where others had stopped digging. The most important step, he would later say, is the one just beyond where everyone else has given up. By the autumn of 1922, he was nearly out of time. Carnarvon had spent a fortune funding the expedition and had grown weary of empty promises. The British press mocked them, calling the venture a nobleman's folly. Carter, refusing to surrender, wrote to Carnarvon with a plea. "If you will grant me one more season, I feel certain we shall find something of supreme interest." The Earl, against his better judgment, agreed. It was a decision that would define both their lives. That November, as workers cleared away the last stretch of rubble near the tomb of Ramses VI, one of them struck a hard object with his pickaxe. Carter, always alert, rushed over. He brushed away the sand and uncovered the edge of a step carved into the limestone. He ordered the men to dig further, revealing a descending staircase. Beneath each step, the air grew cooler, heavier. At the bottom, they found a sealed doorway, its plaster intact. Carter's hands trembled. The royal necropolis seal stared back at him, a jackal watching over bound captives. He knew instantly what it meant. The entrance was quickly covered again. Carter sent a telegram to Carnarvon in England. "At last have made wonderful discovery in valley. A magnificent tomb with seals intact. Recovered same for your arrival. Congratulations." Within days, the Earl and his daughter, Lady Evelyn Herbert, were on their way to Luxor. The world, though it did not yet know it, was on the brink of awakening an ancient secret. Carnarvon's arrival brought an almost theatrical tension to the valley. He was pale and thin, suffering from chronic illness, but excitement restored color to his face. Together, under the watchful eyes of local workers and Egyptian officials, the two men stood before the sealed door. Carter raised a small chisel, ironically one his grandmother had given him when he was a boy, and began to chip away at the plaster. A narrow hole appeared. He lit a candle, shielding the flame from the draft. As he peered inside, golden reflections danced in the darkness. For a moment, time dissolved. Thousands of years of silence vanished in a breath. Carnarvon asked, "Can you see anything?" Carter whispered, "Yes, wonderful things." That moment would be retold endlessly, but its reality was quieter, almost reverent. Carter later wrote that when the air from the tomb first escaped, it carried a faint scent, resin and age, the breath of the past itself. He felt the weight of countless centuries pressing against him, as though the tomb resisted its awakening. Yet he could not stop. The drive that had consumed him for decades left no room for hesitation. The seal was broken. History had been breached. In that instant, Carter's years of hardship, ridicule, and obsession coalesced into triumph. But the desert, which had kept its secret for 3 millennia, does not surrender lightly. Beneath the gold and glory, something unseen began to stir. A current of unease that neither man could name. Some of the workers crossed themselves and whispered prayers. Others refused to continue. To them, the sealed door was not a threshold to knowledge but a gate between worlds. That night, as the torches flickered and the camp settled into silence, Carter sat alone in his tent, staring into the darkness. Outside, the wind moaned across the valley like a distant lament. He should have felt victorious, but what he felt instead was something closer to fear. A sense that he had trespassed on sacred ground. The tomb had been waiting for him, yes, but perhaps not to reward him. Perhaps it had been waiting to test him. What Carter could not know, as he drifted to sleep under the cold desert stars, was that the step he uncovered would lead not only to the greatest archaeological discovery in history, but to one of the most haunting mysteries of the modern age. In the days to come, the world would celebrate him as a hero, then whisper his name with dread. For in opening the tomb, he had not only uncovered a pharaoh's resting place, he had awakened a story that refused to die. The moment the doorway was fully revealed, a hush fell over the Valley of the Kings. Years of labor, anticipation, and obsession coalesced into that single threshold, a barrier between the present and a past that had not been touched for more than 3 millennia. Carter, torch in hand, carefully examined the seal. The plaster bore the familiar images of royal protection. A jackal standing vigilant, human figures bound in submission beneath its paws. Each line, each impression, had been pressed by artisans who understood the gravity of their work. To the ancient Egyptians, this was more than decoration. It was a warning. A king's resting place was sacred, and anyone who disturbed it risked far more than disapproval. Carter's heart raced. He had studied tombs before, had seen the remains of long-dead rulers, but nothing compared to this. The doorway was not just intact, it was untouched. Unlike other tombs, which had been looted, vandalized, or partially destroyed, this one held the promise of complete preservation. The boy king, hidden by centuries of oversight, had been waiting for the right hands to find him. There was reverence in Carter's movements as he chipped away the final traces of the seal. Each fragment that fell into his hands felt like a key unlocking centuries of silence. Inside, the staircase descended into darkness, a narrow corridor carved with careful precision. Carter lit his torches, casting trembling shadows along the walls. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of resin and dust, the odor of time itself. Every step they took seemed to echo back from eternity, as if the tomb were whispering its secrets. The silence was absolute, broken only by the scraping of stone under tools and the occasional creak of wooden supports. Here, at the entrance to Tutankhamun's eternal chamber, the past pressed against the present with a weight almost physical. As they reached the end of the corridor, they arrived at another sealed doorway, this one adorned with hieroglyphs declaring the boy's name and titles. Carter paused, tracing the inscriptions with his fingers. He could almost feel the presence of the king who had lain here for thousands of years, whose fragile life had ended so abruptly, whose tomb had survived by accident and divine providence. With a cautious hand, he tested the seal again. It resisted for a moment, as though reluctant to release its charge of history, before finally giving way. Beyond lay the antechamber, and through its dimly lit expanse, gold gleamed like sunlight captured in solid form. Chests, furniture, statues, and ornaments lined the walls. Carter's eyes widened. He had expected treasure, but not this level of preservation. Every object, every piece of jewelry, every ceremonial item was intact, untouched by time or human greed. The room was a sanctuary of memory, a frozen reflection of a life lived under divine expectation and human fragility. Carter understood in that instant that he was not merely an archaeologist. He was a witness to eternity. But even amid the wonder, unease crept in. The tomb was too perfect, too complete. There was a sense of being observed, of unseen eyes tracking each movement. Carter had always approached tombs with a rational mind. Yet here, in this preserved sanctum, something seemed to push against reason. The workers shifted nervously, some crossing themselves, muttering prayers to keep the spirits at bay. In the flickering torchlight, the statue's eyes seemed alive, gazing with uncanny awareness. Carter, trained in the study of the ancient, felt a chill he could not explain. The antechamber gave way to the inner burial chamber, where the golden sarcophagus awaited. Carter approached cautiously, his breath shallow. The lid was massive, carved with intricate reliefs depicting Tutankhamun's journey through the afterlife. The gods watching, protective yet demanding. The mask, placed delicately atop the boy's mummy, shone with an otherworldly light. Gold, lapis lazuli, and obsidian blended in an unearthly harmony. For a moment, Carter could not look away. The serene face of the king, frozen at the age of 19, seemed to stare back at him, and he felt the weight of centuries pressing on his soul. He stepped closer, noting the inscriptions on the walls. Scenes of gods, guardians, and the king himself lined every surface, vibrant despite millennia underground. Tutankhamun's journey into the afterlife had been depicted with meticulous care, showing rituals, offerings, and the promise of immortality. Each image reinforced the sacredness of this place, and with it the warning: "Here lies the boy king. Disturb him, and you do so at your peril." Carter knew the stories of curses attached to tombs, but he dismissed them. He had never seen them as more than superstition. And yet, standing in the flickering light, with the dense silence pressing in, he felt an unease that even science could not explain. The treasures surrounding the sarcophagus were staggering. Chariots of gilded wood, ceremonial beds, boxes filled with jewelry, and small statuettes of gods awaited the king in eternity. The sheer quantity and quality of the artifacts overwhelmed the senses. Carter cataloged the objects with care, knowing that every note, every sketch, could help preserve the knowledge of a civilization long vanished. Yet, amid the brilliance, there was an almost oppressive stillness, a sense that the tomb itself was aware of his intrusion. Outside the tomb, the world continued unaware of the significance of what had been uncovered. Inside, however, the past and present collided. Carter worked feverishly, knowing that every movement, every breath could awaken curiosity, fear, or even something darker. The tomb had waited long enough. It had remained hidden for thousands of years, and now it had chosen to reveal itself. The discovery was unprecedented, a window into history that no one had anticipated. Even as Carter documented every object, every symbol, every detail, a faint tension lingered in the air. It was as if the tomb itself held its breath, waiting to see how the modern world would respond. Outside, the Egyptian workers spoke in hushed tones of spirits and omens. Some refused to enter the chamber altogether, citing the wrath of Tutankhamun's soul. Carter ignored these warnings, focused entirely on the science, the history, and the glory of discovery. Yet, in the corners of his mind, he could not deny the subtle weight of something unseen, something older than any living memory. In that first revelation, the tomb of Tutankhamun was more than a discovery. It was a confrontation with eternity. Carter had not simply uncovered a king. He had stepped into a story that had been waiting for him for centuries. Every object, every carving, every glittering artifact was a voice from the past, speaking across time to a world that had almost forgotten the boy who had ruled for so short a moment. And as he prepared to breach the inner sanctum fully, he could not have known that this act would ignite a legend, a tale of death, mystery, and fear that would endure far longer than any tomb, far longer than any pharaoh's reign. Weeks passed after the tomb's doors were first opened, and at first, the world marveled only at the splendor Carter and Carnarvon had unearthed. Scholars, collectors, and the press arrived in Cairo, eager to witness the treasures of a civilization long vanished. Yet amid the excitement, shadows began to creep into the story. The first to fall was Lord Carnarvon himself. Only a few weeks after witnessing the treasures, he developed a seemingly innocuous infection, a mosquito bite on his face that became inflamed. Doctors at first considered it a minor wound, easily treated. But within days it escalated. Fever set in, delirium followed, and despite the care of Cairo's finest physicians, the Earl succumbed to blood poisoning at the age of 56. News of Carnarvon's death traveled quickly, first in whispered corridors of the excavation camp, then splashed across newspapers around the globe. The cause, medically mundane, could not suppress the sensationalist interpretation. The Boy King's tomb had claimed its first victim. Panic and fascination intertwined. Reports filtered in of other minor accidents surrounding those connected to the excavation. A worker collapsed after dust exposure. A local guide fell ill unexpectedly. The coincidence seemed too sharp to ignore. Even Carter, rational and meticulous, could not fully dismiss the growing unease. The narrative began to crystallize. The pharaoh's curse had claimed its first life. The newspapers of the 1920s, hungry for sensation, embraced the tale with voracious appetite. Headlines screamed of supernatural vengeance, of a king angry from beyond the grave. Mystery of the Pharaoh's tomb, one read. Death stalks those who disturb ancient secrets, read another. Spiritualists and occultists added fuel to the fire, asserting that Tutankhamun's soul had been awakened by the intrusion, that the boy king, though long dead, could still exact judgment on the living. The world, still reeling from the devastation of the First World War, hungered for mystery. Here was a story of gold, death, and divine retribution, more compelling than anything Europe could produce. Carter, meanwhile, continued his meticulous work, documenting every artifact, cataloging every detail. Yet even he began to notice patterns that unsettled him. Beyond Carnarvon's death, several minor incidents occurred among the team. Some men reported strange chills in the tomb, though the air temperature remained stable. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of their vision. Others claimed faint sounds, whispers perhaps, or the echo of a long-dead world murmuring in a language that the living could not understand. Rationality battled fear in the desert heat, but fear, once planted, proved difficult to uproot. Among the Egyptian laborers, superstition grew. Many had grown up hearing stories of tomb curses, of restless spirits, of divine wrath against grave robbers. To them, the sudden death of Lord Carnarvon was proof. Some refused to enter the tomb entirely. Others performed small protective rituals. Offerings of bread, prayers whispered into the wind, gestures meant to appease whatever forces lingered beyond human perception. Even those who did not believe in curses could not help but feel the tension, the sense of eyes watching from the shadows of the sarcophagi. In Cairo, society gossiped. Expatriates and locals alike speculated wildly. Some claimed the tomb's opening had unleashed ancient spirits, ancient poisons, or even a plague long trapped within the sealed chamber. Others suggested darker possibilities, that Carter or his team might have been cursed by enemies within the excavation, or that the desert itself, alive with memory, had exacted revenge. Stories multiplied, each more lurid than the last. The world seemed to hang suspended between skepticism and terror, unable to dismiss the mystery entirely. Even as fear spread, curiosity intensified. Museums clamored for artifacts, scholars sought permission to study the objects, and journalists pursued Carter for details. His private journals, filled with careful observations, became a secondary battlefield for speculation. Every entry, every note, was dissected for hidden signs, as though the boy king's will might be discerned through handwriting and inventory lists. Carter resisted sensationalism, but the tide of public fascination was unstoppable. The curse, once whispered, had become a global obsession. What made the story gripping was not just Carnarvon's death, but the coincidences that seemed to follow. A doctor who had treated him fell ill days later. A family member of a supporting archaeologist reportedly experienced sudden misfortune. Even animals seemed to behave strangely. Letters from England recounted dogs howling inexplicably at night, cats refusing to enter rooms, birds dying without warning. Each anecdote, though unverifiable, fed the growing mythos. The boy king, it seemed, was exacting judgment from beyond the grave. Despite these events, Carter pressed forward. The tomb demanded attention, and he believed history depended on his diligence. He opened the inner chambers, examined the sarcophagus, and recorded the treasures with meticulous care. But the presence of the dead seemed to linger. Workers spoke of shadows moving where none should, of lights flickering inexplicably. The air occasionally grew so cold that breath hung visibly, despite the desert heat. Rational explanations, drafts, dust, fatigue were proposed, yet they offered little comfort to those attuned to the whispers of superstition. Within weeks, the legend of the Pharaoh's curse spread far beyond Egypt. Newspapers in London, New York, and Paris reported every misfortune, every illness, every odd occurrence as evidence. Lecturers gave talks on the supernatural, skeptics argued fiercely, and spiritualists offered ceremonies to appease Tutankhamun's spirit. The world was captivated by a narrative that combined gold, mystery, and mortality. The boy king, who had lived and died in relative obscurity, now loomed over the imagination of millions. And so the first death became the cornerstone of a myth. It was simple yet irresistible. Open the tomb and death may follow. Carnarvon's fate was tragic, but it was also symbolic. It suggested a direct link between human curiosity and ancient judgment. Every artifact, every gilded object, every fragment of history became part of the story. Tutankhamun's tomb was no longer merely a site of archaeology. It was a stage on which the human mind performed its oldest fears, its fascination with death, and its need to believe that some forces remain beyond understanding. The death of Lord Carnarvon did more than shock those present. It created a lens through which the entire discovery would be viewed. The tomb was no longer a treasure trove. It was a haunted space. Visitors, scholars, and laborers approached with caution, respect, and a lingering sense of dread. Even Carter, the man who had spent his life mastering the discipline of observation and reason, could not entirely shake the feeling that he had disturbed something sacred, something that had waited millennia for humans to forget it, and now had begun to remind them of its power. From that moment forward, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb was inseparable from the narrative of death. The boy king, silent for thousands of years, had suddenly become the arbiter of mortality in the modern world. And as the world read, whispered, and speculated, the legend of the pharaoh's curse was born. An intertwining of history, fear, and human fascination that would endure far longer than any newsprint or tomb ever could. The death of Lord Carnarvon ignited a firestorm of speculation, and soon, the so-called pharaoh's curse began to take on a life of its own. What had once been a remarkable archaeological achievement became a story entwined with fear, superstition, and a growing fascination with the supernatural. Newspapers around the world fed the legend, publishing lurid accounts of sudden deaths, freak accidents, and unexplained misfortunes among those connected to the tomb. Even the most rational minds struggled to ignore the mounting coincidences, and soon the world was captivated by the idea that Tutankhamun's spirit, angered by the intrusion, had been awakened to punish the living. Carter, meticulous and methodical, found himself caught between two worlds. On one hand, he was a scientist, dedicated to recording and preserving the boy king's tomb in all its splendor. On the other, he could not entirely ignore the chilling anecdotes that filtered back from workers, visitors, and distant correspondents. Some claimed to hear whispers in the dark corridors of the tomb. Others reported strange drafts, sudden chills, or shadows moving where none should be. A camel driver swore he saw a glimmer of gold floating in the air at the tomb's entrance at midnight. Carter dismissed these as hallucinations or fatigue, but the repetition, the consistency of reports, began to unsettle even him. It was not long before more prominent figures were caught up in the narrative. An American journalist who had visited the site fell ill soon after returning to Cairo. A local guide experienced a series of minor accidents that left him bedridden. Animals in and around the excavation camp behaved strangely. Dogs refused to enter certain rooms, cats hissed at empty corners, and birds would not perch on the edge of the tomb's staircases. Each incident, however trivial in isolation, fed a growing perception that the tomb itself was an agent of vengeance. The world began to view the discovery not merely as a historical achievement but as a provocation of powers beyond comprehension. Scholars attempted to intervene, arguing that what people called a curse was nothing more than coincidence, amplified by media hysteria. They pointed out that excavating ancient tombs was physically hazardous work, prone to disease, injury, and accident. Exposure to mold, dust, and decaying organic matter could easily explain illness. Lord Carnarvon, for instance, had contracted a common infection that escalated tragically due to untreated conditions. Yet rational explanations did little to temper the imagination of the public. Stories of curses were far more compelling than statistics, and the myth began to grow with a momentum all its own. Among the local Egyptian workers, fear intensified. Many of them had grown up steeped in folklore, learning that tombs were not merely resting places but sanctuaries of divine judgment. To violate a tomb was to invite the wrath of its occupant. Prayers, small offerings, and rituals became commonplace, not out of devout faith alone, but from a deep-seated sense of survival. Some workers refused to enter the inner chambers altogether, insisting that the boy king's spirit could reach across time to punish them. Others claimed to hear footsteps echoing behind them when the tomb was empty, or to see the glint of golden eyes in the darkness. To them, the curse was real. The fascination spread beyond Egypt. European spiritualists and occultists seized upon the story, claiming that Tutankhamun's deathly warnings were evidence of the supernatural, a sign that the ancient Egyptians had possessed knowledge and power lost to modern humanity. They published pamphlets, gave lectures, and consulted with believers, weaving the narrative into a tapestry of fear and intrigue. Even in London, Cairo's cafes buzzed with tales of invisible guardians, spectral serpents, and the vengeance of a king who had lain dormant for thousands of years. The world could not resist the allure of a tale where history, death, and myth collided. Carter, for his part, remained resolute in his work, but the weight of the superstition pressed upon him. He meticulously catalogued the treasures of the tomb: golden chariots, statues of gods, intricately carved jewelry, ceremonial beds, and the mask that had become the emblem of the boy king. Yet every time he entered the tomb, he could not shake the feeling that he was being observed, that the golden eyes of Tutankhamun, fixed for centuries, followed him. Workers whispered about shadows that lingered, and even Carter admitted that sometimes the air seemed to shift in a way that no logical explanation could account for. The press, sensing opportunity, amplified every small story into sensational headlines. A minor accident became "The tomb strikes again." A worker's sudden illness became "Tutankhamun's revenge." Letters from readers describing eerie occurrences were reprinted as evidence of the curse's reach. The narrative grew unchecked, spreading from Europe to America, from Cairo to small towns across the globe. Tutankhamun had become not merely a historical figure but a symbol of the unknown, a specter whose power was measured not in gold but in fear. In the shadow of these reports, the modern world was forced to confront its own anxieties. The 1920s were a time of scientific progress, industrial achievement, and urban expansion. Yet the story of Tutankhamun's tomb reminded people that even with knowledge, humans remained vulnerable to forces beyond understanding. The intersection of life and death, past and present, tangible history and intangible myth, fascinated and terrified alike. Carter's excavation, meant to illuminate history, had inadvertently reignited ancient fears, proving that some boundaries, once crossed, cannot easily be restored. Yet, amid the hysteria, the truth remained complex. Many accidents could be explained through mundane causes: disease, poor sanitation, the inherent dangers of excavation. But human nature is drawn to story, and the idea of an angry, immortal boy king exacting revenge was far more compelling than scientific reasoning. The pharaoh's curse was, in a sense, a mirror held up to society, a reflection of fear, awe, and the enduring power of myth. The tomb, its treasures, and its silent occupant became not only historical artifacts but actors in a drama that had unfolded across continents. As months passed, the legend became self-reinforcing. Every subsequent misfortune associated with the tomb, whether coincidental or imagined, was interpreted through the lens of the curse. Visitors approached with caution, journalists speculated wildly, and the Egyptian workers maintained rituals that had been in place for centuries, now renewed with urgency. Tutankhamun's death, long ago, had been a personal tragedy. Now, his tomb had become an agent of collective imagination, demonstrating the powerful intersection of history, superstition, and storytelling. In the end, the pharaoh's curse was more than a simple legend. It was a confluence of coincidence, fear, and the human desire to find meaning in the unknown. Carter's meticulous scholarship preserved the boy king's treasures, but it could not control the stories that emerged from the excavation. Tutankhamun, through his tomb, his gold, and his sudden reemergence into the modern world, had become a voice from beyond the grave. He was both a reminder of mortality and a cautionary figure, a symbol of the dangers of disturbing what was meant to remain hidden. Even today, the myth persists. The boy king, entombed for thousands of years, continues to captivate the imagination, a testament to the enduring power of fear and fascination. Carter's discovery was monumental, but the legend of Tutankhamun's curse ensured that it would be remembered not only as an archaeological triumph but as a story in which history, myth, and mortality collided in ways the modern world could neither fully comprehend nor resist. As the legend of Tutankhamun's curse spread across the globe, the public fascination shifted from pure wonder to a darker curiosity. Newspapers published ever more sensational accounts, blending fact and fiction into a narrative that blurred the line between history and horror. Tales of sudden deaths, bizarre accidents, and inexplicable illnesses began to circulate with relentless persistence. One journalist, upon returning from the Valley of the Kings, claimed he had been stalked by a shadowy figure whenever he entered his hotel room at night. Another reported that a coffin in a distant museum seemed to tremble, as though alive. The world was hungry for evidence that the boy king's spirit had indeed awakened, and it eagerly seized every whispered story, every coincidence, as proof. Meanwhile, Howard Carter labored in near isolation, cataloging the treasures with painstaking care. Days blended into nights as he recorded the positions of chariots, the placement of jewelry, and the inscriptions on the walls. His notebooks grew thick with sketches, measurements, and observations. Yet even as he meticulously documented the tomb, Carter could not ignore the rising tension among his team. Some workers spoke of sounds they could not identify, footsteps in empty corridors, the distant ringing of bells with no source, a faint scent of resin that would appear suddenly and vanish without explanation. Rational explanations, creaking wood, shifting stone, the wind, could account for some phenomena, but not for all. The Egyptian laborers, steeped in traditional beliefs, grew increasingly anxious. To them, the tomb was not merely a repository of gold. It was a sacred space, a bridge between the mortal world and the afterlife. Disturbing it was to risk the wrath of a god, a punishment that transcended human understanding. Many refused to enter the innermost chambers, performing protective rituals outside the tomb instead. Others claimed that they saw Tutankhamun's eyes in the flickering torchlight, following their every movement, judging their intrusion. Fear, once a whisper, became a palpable presence, shadowing every step Carter and his team took. Beyond the excavation site, the story took on new dimensions. Spiritualists and occultists, both in Egypt and abroad, seized upon the legend of the curse. They claimed that Tutankhamun's tomb was a portal, a conduit for supernatural forces that could extend the king's judgment across time. Lectures were held in London, Paris, and New York, where enthusiasts speculated on the ancient Egyptians' mastery of magic, the power of curses, and the limits of human understanding. For the wider public, the tomb had become less an archaeological achievement and more a stage upon which the mysterious and terrifying could perform. Even scientists were not immune to the growing narrative. Some speculated that pathogens preserved within the tomb could be responsible for the deaths and illnesses reported among those who had entered. Mold spores, bacteria, and other microorganisms might have been trapped in the sealed chambers for millennia, released only when the tomb was breached. It was a rational explanation, grounded in modern understanding of microbiology, yet it lacked the drama and allure of a supernatural narrative. People were far more fascinated by the idea that Tutankhamun himself was exacting vengeance from beyond the grave. As the weeks passed, every minor accident or illness became fodder for the legend. A curator in London, handling an artifact that had been sent from Egypt, suddenly fell ill. A photographer's camera mysteriously failed while filming the tomb's interior. Even animals seemed to behave strangely. Dogs refused to enter certain rooms, birds would not perch near the tomb's artifacts, and cats hissed at empty corners. Each coincidence was interpreted as further evidence of the curse, and the narrative became self-reinforcing. Fear and fascination fed one another, creating a mythos that expanded far beyond the excavation site. Within the tomb, Carter continued his careful work, undeterred by the growing hysteria. He documented Tutankhamun's sarcophagus, the golden mask, the nested coffins, and the treasures surrounding the king's remains. He measured the tomb's dimensions, cataloged hieroglyphs, and preserved fragile artifacts with painstaking precision. Yet even as he worked, he could not ignore the subtle unease that lingered. The tomb was silent, but its silence carried a weight, a sense of expectation, a presence that seemed to observe every movement. The boy king, though long dead, exerted a subtle influence over those who disturbed his eternal rest. Carter's rationality was tested further by the reactions of visitors and officials. Many entered the tomb expecting to witness the extraordinary, yet some left shaken, unnerved by the atmosphere, convinced that they had glimpsed something beyond explanation. Even seasoned archaeologists, trained in empirical observation, reported strange sensations. Sudden cold drafts in the chambers, shadows that seemed to move independently, and inexplicable noises. The tomb had become a crucible for human perception, blending reality and imagination in ways that defied easy interpretation. Meanwhile, the public obsession with the curse reached new heights. Newspapers published letters from readers claiming to have experienced strange phenomena, creating a feedback loop in which the story of Tutankhamun's vengeance grew increasingly elaborate. The tomb's discovery became not only a historical milestone but a cultural phenomenon, shaping perceptions of ancient Egypt for decades to come. The boy king, once a minor figure in history, had been resurrected in the collective imagination, his power amplified by myth and media alike. The legend also influenced archaeology itself. Some scholars became wary of exploring tombs, fearing the wrath of the pharaohs, while others were drawn precisely by the allure of danger. Tutankhamun's tomb became both a cautionary tale and an irresistible mystery, illustrating the enduring tension between human curiosity and the unknown. It was a reminder that history is never merely a record of the past. It is also a mirror of human fears, ambitions, and desires. In the midst of this growing hysteria, Carter remained steadfast, balancing scientific rigor with an acknowledgement of the tomb's extraordinary psychological impact. He recorded every detail meticulously, yet he could not entirely dismiss the stories of shadows, whispers, and chills. The tomb, though physical and finite, exerted a presence that transcended the material. Tutankhamun, in his gold and linen, had become a symbol, a voice from beyond that challenged the living to confront the boundaries between life and death, reason and superstition, history and myth. By the end of the first year after the tomb's opening, the narrative of the pharaoh's curse had taken firm root. It was no longer just a series of coincidences. It had become a story, a cautionary tale, and a spectacle, all rolled into one. The Boy King's tomb had transformed from a historical site into a cultural touchstone, a source of fascination, fear, and reverence. And through it all, Howard Carter, tireless and disciplined, continued his work, preserving the treasures and the story of a pharaoh whose brief life and long death would captivate the world for generations. As the world fixated on the myth of Tutankhamun's curse, the excavation camp became a place where history, superstition, and human emotion collided. Howard Carter's meticulous work continued, yet he could no longer deny the eerie atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of the tomb. Even the simplest tasks, cataloging jewelry, examining chariots, sketching statues, were shadowed by a sense of being watched. The golden mask of the Boy King, serene and immovable, seemed to reflect more than light. It reflected expectation, judgment, and the silent persistence of a presence that had waited millennia to be seen. The Egyptian workers, whose hands had unearthed countless tombs before, were increasingly reluctant to enter the innermost chambers. They spoke in hushed tones of whispered warnings from ancestors and signs from the gods. Some claimed that, at night, the tomb itself seemed alive. Faint glimmers of gold would appear where no light had been placed, soft sounds echoed down the corridors, and an oppressive stillness would settle over the camp as if holding its breath. Rituals became a daily necessity. Small offerings of bread and incense, prayers uttered to ward off spirits, and gestures to honor the dead. Fear and respect had become intertwined in ways that science could neither measure nor dismiss. Visitors arrived in increasing numbers, drawn by both curiosity and the growing legend of supernatural consequences. Scholars, collectors, and journalists approached the tomb with a mixture of reverence and trepidation. Some came expecting marvels, others expecting danger. Many reported unexplainable experiences. Flashes of movement in empty corners, faint voices carried on the desert wind, and sudden chills that seemed to emanate from the tomb itself. Even seasoned professionals trained in observation admitted that the environment challenged their perception, blurring the line between physical reality and psychological suggestion. Meanwhile, Howard Carter pressed on with his methodical documentation. He carefully recorded the exact positions of artifacts, meticulously measured hieroglyphs, and sketched every object with the precision that had made him renowned. Yet even he was not immune to the subtle unease of the tomb. He noted in his journal moments when torches flickered without cause or when shadows seemed to twist independently of their source. These observations were recorded clinically, yet the language betrays a quiet fascination, a recognition that Tutankhamun's tomb was more than a historical site. It was an immersive experience that tested the limits of rationality. The world outside the Valley of the Kings had become enraptured by the story. Newspapers and periodicals around the globe sensationalized every accident, every minor illness, and every anecdotal report from the excavation site. Headlines screamed of deaths, spectral sightings, and divine retribution. Letters arrived from readers claiming personal encounters with the pharaoh's wrath, reinforcing the legend. Spiritualists and occultists added layers of narrative, asserting that the tomb's opening had unleashed ancient Egyptian magic, a protective force capable of reaching across time to punish the living. The boy king, long silent and forgotten, had suddenly assumed a voice that the modern world could not ignore. Even rational explanations struggled to contain the myth. Scientists speculated about pathogens preserved in the sealed tomb, mold spores, or gases that could have caused illness. Yet these explanations could not account for the full range of experiences reported. Sudden cold drafts in the heat of the desert, the sensation of unseen eyes upon the living, or the repeated coincidence of misfortune among those involved. The pharaoh's curse had become both tangible and psychological, a phenomenon that challenged understanding while captivating imagination. As the months progressed, incidents continued to reinforce the emerging narrative. Workers reported hearing footsteps in empty corridors and glimpsing flickers of gold where no torchlight reached. Visitors described feelings of dread, an almost magnetic awareness that the tomb's occupant was present. Some even claimed to hear voices murmuring in hieroglyphic tones that they could not comprehend. Each new report, whether true or embellished, was absorbed into the growing mythology, further entwining fact and fear. The psychological impact on Carter and his team was significant. They were driven by the need to preserve and document, yet they were also confronted with phenomena that challenged their empirical training. Anxiety, tension, and fatigue compounded, creating a charged atmosphere in which every shadow was suspect and every unexpected sound a potential omen. Even the most rational minds began to accept that the tomb itself exerted influence, whether through ancient craftsmanship, environmental effects, or something less tangible. The treasures of the tomb only heightened the intensity. Golden chariots, statues of gods, ceremonial beds, and intricate jewelry were not merely objects. They were conduits of narrative, symbols of a culture that revered life, death, and divine authority. Each artifact, preserved perfectly for millennia, seemed to carry the aura of the boy king himself. Workers and visitors alike were struck by the artistry and the power imbued in each piece. Some swore that the objects seemed to radiate energy, a silent assertion of the pharaoh's presence that no rational explanation could entirely dismiss. Carter's documentation of the burial chamber, the sarcophagus, and the nested coffins revealed astonishing craftsmanship. The gold mask, in particular, became an icon, not merely for its beauty, but for its perceived power. It was a face frozen in serenity, yet observers sensed an unspoken authority, a silent warning. To touch, to observe, or to disturb the mask became an act imbued with ritual significance, whether one believed in curses or not. The object, and by extension the boy king, had asserted dominance over the modern world simply by being found. In parallel, the cultural and social ramifications were profound. Tutankhamun's tomb transformed the way the modern world viewed Egypt, archaeology, and mortality. The story of the boy king's death and the subsequent misfortunes of those who disturbed his tomb captured imaginations, blending history, horror, and fascination. It revealed a universal human impulse, the desire to connect with the past, even at the risk of awakening forces better left undisturbed. The myth of the pharaoh's curse became a lens through which the modern world examined its relationship with history, mortality, and the unknown. By the end of this phase of excavation, it was clear that Tutankhamun's tomb was more than a repository of artifacts. It was an immersive experience, a psychological crucible in which human curiosity, fear, and reverence collided. The boy king, who had been largely invisible for millennia, had returned with a presence that transcended time. Through gold, linen, and carved stone, he commanded attention, respect, and, for many, fear. Carter's careful scholarship preserved the tangible evidence, but the intangible influence, the sense that Tutankhamun's spirit lingered, remained unresolved, an enduring mystery that the world would continue to debate and revere. As Howard Carter continued his painstaking work within Tutankhamun's tomb, the world outside became increasingly captivated by the unfolding drama. Each day, new treasures were documented, measured, and sketched with extraordinary precision. Yet the narrative surrounding the boy king's curse continued to grow, fueled by coincidence, rumor, and human fascination with the unknown. The tomb, once a silent repository of a forgotten pharaoh, had become a living stage upon which the modern world played out its anxieties, ambitions, and deepest fears. Carter, dedicated to the pursuit of knowledge, found himself navigating a delicate balance between empirical observation and the undeniable weight of the legend that had sprung to life around him. Within the tomb, Carter's methodical work revealed layers of artistry and ritual that spoke to the Egyptians' obsession with life after death. Nested coffins, the innermost of solid gold, cradled Tutankhamun's body, while the golden mask rested over his head, an eternal visage of youth, serenity, and authority. Chests, beds, and chariots were placed with meticulous intent, ensuring the king would have everything necessary for his journey into eternity. Every artifact told a story, not just of wealth or power, but of the beliefs, fears, and hopes of a civilization devoted to the afterlife. To Carter, these objects were not merely material. They were voices across millennia, speaking directly to those who dared to disturb them. Despite his focus, Carter could not ignore the mounting tension among his team and the Egyptian workers. Fear and superstition had taken root, amplified by the eerie atmosphere of the tomb itself. Workers reported strange occurrences. Shadows moving independently of light sources, inexplicable cold drafts in the otherwise stifling heat of the chambers, and the sensation of being observed. Some refused to enter certain rooms altogether, performing small rituals outside the tomb to protect themselves. Others whispered of glimpsing Tutankhamun's eyes in the flickering torchlight, his presence judging every action. Even Carter, rational and disciplined, noted moments when the weight of the tomb seemed almost physical, pressing down on him as he worked. The world beyond the Valley of the Kings eagerly consumed every detail, blending fact and sensationalism. Newspapers, magazines, and books chronicled the supposed curse, presenting it alongside the remarkable discoveries within the tomb. Reports of minor illnesses or accidents among those associated with the excavation were elevated into evidence of Tutankhamun's wrath. Spiritualists claimed that the boy king's spirit had been awakened by the intrusion, while skeptics argued for coincidence and human error. Regardless of explanation, the myth persisted, growing in reach and intensity. The tomb's discovery had become more than a historical milestone. It was a cultural phenomenon, capturing imaginations with the irresistible lure of mystery and danger. Within this charged atmosphere, Carter pressed forward with his work, documenting treasures in incredible detail. Each object was photographed, drawn, and described, preserving not just the artifact itself but its placement, context, and relationship to surrounding items. He understood that this level of documentation was essential, as the tomb could not remain untouched indefinitely. Scholars and museums around the world awaited reports, eager to study and display the artifacts. Yet even as Carter worked with discipline and precision, he felt the tension of history pressing against him, a silent reminder that the past can exert influence in ways that defy logic and expectation. Among the treasures, Carter discovered objects of astonishing craftsmanship and symbolic significance. Golden thrones adorned with intricate carvings depicted the king in the company of gods, while ceremonial weapons and amulets reinforced his divine protection. Small statues, charms, and ceremonial vessels were positioned with purpose, each playing a role in ensuring the pharaoh's safe passage to the afterlife. The tomb, in its entirety, was a carefully constructed microcosm of the cosmos, a space where life, death, and the divine converged. The attention to detail was staggering, and Carter recognized that this level of preservation was unprecedented. Tutankhamun's modest reign in life had been magnified into eternal grandeur in death, an eternal assertion of power through meticulous ritual and artistry. Yet amid the wonder, Carter could not ignore the subtle unease that permeated the tomb. Even the air seemed different, heavy with the scent of resin and the weight of centuries. Shadows played tricks on the eyes, and sounds carried in ways that defied expectation. Workers occasionally reported faint whispers or the sensation of breath against their skin when no one else was near. Rational explanations, drafts, settling stone, or fatigue were offered, but the repetition and consistency of the reports created an atmosphere that challenged skepticism. The tomb had become a place where rationality and fear coexisted uneasily, a crucible in which human curiosity and the unknown collided. As the legend of the curse grew, it began to shape behavior outside the tomb. Visitors approached with caution, some hesitant to even step inside the Valley of the Kings. Scholars debated whether exposure to ancient pathogens could explain illnesses, while others considered the tomb itself a repository of supernatural power. The narrative of Tutankhamun's vengeance, whether real or imagined, influenced perceptions, shaping interactions, research priorities, and the mythology surrounding Egypt. The boy king, who had been all but forgotten for centuries, had suddenly assumed a place of authority over the living, not through force but through the stories that humans told about him. Carter, despite being at the center of the unfolding legend, maintained a careful equilibrium. He documented every artifact, every symbol, and every anomaly with clinical precision, yet he was acutely aware of the psychological impact the tomb exerted. It was a space where history, fear, and imagination intertwined, producing experiences that transcended simple observation. The tomb demanded attention, respect, and careful handling, not only for its physical contents but for the intangible presence that seemed to linger, watching, waiting, and exerting influence. Through this meticulous work, Carter preserved the boy king's treasures and created a detailed record of the tomb's entirety, ensuring that future generations could study and understand the ancient world. At the same time, he unwittingly contributed to the growing mythos of the pharaoh's curse. The interplay between the tangible and intangible, the gold, the hieroglyphs, and the perceived presence of the king, ensured that Tutankhamun's tomb would be remembered not merely as an archaeological site but as a locus of mystery, fear, and fascination. Carter's discoveries had not only resurrected a long-forgotten pharaoh, but also ignited a narrative that would captivate the world for decades. By the end of this stage of excavation, it was clear that Tutankhamun's tomb was more than a collection of artifacts. It was a conduit through which history, mortality, and myth converged. The boy king, preserved in gold and linen, had returned to the consciousness of the modern world. Through meticulous scholarship and careful preservation, Carter ensured that the physical evidence would endure. Yet the intangible influence, the sensation of presence, the stories of misfortune, the psychological weight of history, remained a compelling and unresolved aspect of the discovery. Tutankhamun's tomb was at once an archaeological marvel, a cultural phenomenon, and a cautionary tale, demonstrating the enduring tension between human curiosity and forces beyond comprehension. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had transformed Howard Carter's life, elevating him from a meticulous, relatively obscure archaeologist into a figure whose work captivated the globe. Yet amid the acclaim, a shadow lingered, cast not by the desert sun but by the legend of the pharaoh's curse. Reports of accidents, illnesses, and unexplained events continued to circulate, creating an atmosphere in which rationality and superstition intertwined so tightly that even the most disciplined observer could feel the tension. Carter, though dedicated to empirical work, began to understand that the tomb was not merely a physical site. It was a catalyst for stories, fears, and imaginings that transcended the material. The excavation continued with painstaking care. Every artifact was measured, drawn, photographed, and catalogued. The nested coffins, including the innermost gold sarcophagus, were carefully studied, and the golden funerary mask of Tutankhamun became an icon, revered not only for its artistry, but for the aura it seemed to project. Chariots, ceremonial beds, thrones, and countless smaller items were recorded with precision, each object a testament to the sophistication of a civilization obsessed with the afterlife. The tomb itself was a microcosm, a carefully orchestrated universe where life, death, and divine protection converged. Despite the extraordinary success, the human element of the excavation introduced complications. The Egyptian workers, steeped in cultural traditions and folklore, were increasingly uneasy. Some refused to enter the innermost chambers, performing protective rituals outside the tomb instead. Others whispered of sounds, shadows, and glimmers of gold that appeared without explanation. The psychological weight of these reports was palpable. Carter, though rational, could not entirely dismiss the intensity of fear and awe surrounding the tomb. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, unease, and respect for a boy king who had reigned briefly yet commanded such enduring attention. The legend of the curse expanded beyond Egypt, carried by newspapers, letters, and books that sensationalized every minor incident. A visitor to the tomb might catch a cold or twist an ankle, and suddenly it became evidence of supernatural judgment. Spiritualists proclaimed that Tutankhamun's spirit had been awakened, that the tomb was imbued with protective forces capable of reaching across time. Skeptics attempted to ground events in science, suggesting mold spores, bacteria, or natural accidents, but these explanations lacked the drama and immediacy of a story in which the dead could exact vengeance. The myth of the pharaoh's curse, once a whisper, had become a global narrative, entwining curiosity, fear, and human fascination with the unknown. Even the scientific team was affected by the growing narrative. Carter and his associates noticed subtle occurrences that challenged straightforward explanation. Sudden drafts in the tomb's chambers, shadows that flickered independently of light sources, and the faint scent of resin that seemed to appear spontaneously. Rational explanations, settling stone, airflow, fatigue, could account for some phenomena. Yet the consistency of reports from multiple observers added weight to the eerie reputation of the tomb. The line between coincidence and design seemed to blur, and the tomb assumed a presence of its own, influencing the perceptions of all who entered. The treasures themselves reinforced the sensation of power and presence. Every object was more than material wealth. Each carried symbolism, ritual function, and cultural significance. Amulets, statues, chests, and ceremonial instruments had been placed with precise intent, designed to ensure the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Even the smallest objects seemed to resonate with meaning, as if the boy king's essence lingered in the arrangement, the weight, and the shine of each item. Visitors frequently commented on an almost palpable aura, a sense of being observed or judged by an unseen presence. The tomb was no longer simply a repository of history. It was a crucible for human perception and imagination. Carter documented these details meticulously, noting not only the physical characteristics of the artifacts but also the reactions of those present. He recorded moments when workers recoiled at shadows, when torches flickered unexpectedly, or when faint whispers seemed to emanate from the walls. In his journals, Carter maintained a careful balance, clinical observation coexisting with acknowledgement of the psychological and cultural weight of the tomb. In doing so, he preserved not only the objects themselves but also the human experience of discovery, including fear, awe, and the unsettling sense of the past pressing into the present. The public fascination intensified as stories circulated of those connected to the excavation experiencing misfortune. While some incidents could be explained by coincidence or occupational hazard, The accumulation of these stories reinforced the perception of the curse. Even individuals far removed from the site reported unexplainable events after handling artifacts, traveling from Cairo to London. Animals were reported behaving strangely near objects from the tomb, dogs refusing to enter certain rooms, cats hissing at empty corners. Each story, true or exaggerated, fed a self-perpetuating narrative, giving the Boy King a presence in the modern imagination that he had never held in life. Carter's own interactions with visitors reflected the tension between curiosity and fear. Scholars approached with caution, journalists with eagerness for sensational material. Many were awed by the treasures but unnerved by the atmosphere. Some reported dizziness, chills, or a sense of unease that could not be explained by the desert heat or the psychological strain of the experience. The tomb had become both a site of empirical study and a theater for human imagination, in which every shadow, sound, and flicker of light was magnified by the weight of legend and expectation. The legend of the curse also affected archaeology itself. Scholars became more cautious in their excavation techniques, aware that stories of supernatural retribution could influence public perception, funding, and worker morale. Simultaneously, the allure of danger drew adventurers and archaeologists, seeking not only historical knowledge but the thrill of interacting with something deemed sacred and potentially perilous. Tutankhamun's tomb, once an isolated site in the Valley of the Kings, had become a symbol of the intersection of human ambition, cultural memory, and the unknowable forces of history. By the conclusion of this period of excavation, the Boy King's tomb was recognized as an unprecedented archaeological achievement. Yet its impact extended far beyond scholarship. It had become a cultural touchstone, blending history, myth, and psychological experience. Tutankhamun, long deceased, had reasserted his presence in the modern world through artifacts, narrative, and the powerful imagination of those who encountered him. Carter, steadfast in his work, preserved the physical evidence of the tomb while simultaneously participating in the creation of a legend that would endure for generations. A testament to the enduring power of fear, fascination, and the human desire to connect with the past. The unfolding drama of Tutankhamun's tomb had reached a point where history, superstition, and human emotion were inseparable. Howard Carter continued his meticulous documentation, fully aware that every artifact, every placement, and every measurement carried significance not just for scholarship, but for a world increasingly obsessed with the pharaoh's curse. Yet the legend was no longer confined to whispers in Cairo or the pages of scholarly journals. It had become a global phenomenon. Tales of misfortune among those connected to the excavation circulated widely, often exaggerated, often fabricated, but always compelling. Each new report reinforced the notion that the Boy King's tomb was more than a repository of gold. It was a locus of power, fear, and fascination. Carter's daily routine was both extraordinary and exhausting. He moved systematically through the antechamber and burial chamber, recording the position and condition of each object. The treasures were staggering in both quantity and artistry. Golden chariots gleamed with intricate detail, ceremonial thrones bore elaborate carvings of gods and kings, and countless amulets and statuettes filled every available space. Carter sketched, measured, and photographed each artifact, noting the materials used, their dimensions, and any inscriptions or hieroglyphs. Even small objects, cosmetic tools, jewelry boxes, and ritual implements, were treated with the utmost care, preserving a record for future study. Yet amid this work, the atmosphere remained tense, tinged with a sense of something beyond the material. The Egyptian workers, whose labor had made the discovery possible, were increasingly vocal about the tomb's perceived power. Some refused to enter the inner chambers, citing ancestral warnings and the necessity of protective rituals. Others performed small ceremonies, scattering incense, leaving bread or fruit as offerings, or whispering prayers to appease the Boy King. These actions were not merely superstition. They were a reflection of deeply held cultural beliefs that the tomb was a sacred space, a bridge between life and the afterlife. Workers reported sensations of cold in the otherwise sweltering desert, the flicker of shadows where no light existed, and faint sounds they could not explain. The tomb had become a space where fear, respect, and awe coexisted, shaping every human interaction within its walls. Outside the Valley of the Kings, the world consumed every detail with insatiable curiosity. Newspapers in Europe and America published reports of deaths, accidents, and strange occurrences linked to the tomb, often embellishing facts to heighten the drama. Spiritualists asserted that Tutankhamun's spirit had been awakened, capable of reaching across time to punish intruders. Skeptics offered rational explanations, bacterial infections, dust, or simple coincidence, but the allure of a supernatural narrative proved irresistible. The Boy King, once obscure, had become a symbol of divine power and the unknowable, a phantom whose influence extended far beyond the desert sands of Egypt. Even among scholars and archaeologists, the reputation of the tomb affected behavior. Some approached with caution, wary of the psychological weight the site carried. Others were drawn precisely because of the allure of danger and mystery. Tutankhamun's tomb had become both a source of knowledge and a test of courage, challenging modern perceptions of history, mortality, and the supernatural. The Boy King's presence, whether real or imagined, demanded a response from all who encountered it, shaping not only their actions but also the stories they carried back to the wider world. Carter, immersed in his work, documented not only the physical artifacts but also the human responses to the tomb. He recorded moments when workers recoiled at shadows, when torches flickered for no apparent reason, or when faint whispers seemed to emanate from the walls. His journals reveal a careful observer, a man who balanced scientific rigor with an acknowledgement of the tomb's psychological impact. These observations, while objective in tone, reflect the tension between rationality and the intangible sense of presence that seemed to pervade the chambers. The tomb was both a physical space and a psychological crucible, where the mind and imagination were tested as much as the eyes and hands. The treasures themselves were extraordinary, each item a reflection of ancient Egyptian belief, artistry, and ritual practice. The golden funerary mask of Tutankhamun, with its serene expression and flawless craftsmanship, became the centerpiece of both scholarship and legend. Nested coffins, ceremonial beds, chariots, and countless smaller objects were arranged with precision, ensuring the pharaoh's journey into the afterlife. Each artifact was imbued with symbolic meaning, reinforcing the Boy King's divine protection and the Egyptian worldview that death was not an end, but a transition to a continued existence. For those present, the objects radiated a sense of purpose and power, a reminder that they were intruding upon a space both sacred and eternal. Amid the wonder, subtle phenomena persisted. Workers reported shadows moving independently of light, faint scents of resin appearing suddenly, and chills in chambers that should have been warm. Some visitors claimed to hear whispers in languages they could not understand, while others reported the feeling of unseen eyes tracking their movements. Rational explanations existed: air currents, structural settling, fatigue, but the regularity and consistency of these reports added to the growing perception that the tomb was more than stone and gold. It was a space alive with history, memory, and perhaps something beyond human comprehension. The cultural impact was immense. Tutankhamun's tomb reshaped perceptions of ancient Egypt, archaeology, and the relationship between the living and the dead. It illustrated the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and mystery, rationality and imagination. The legend of the curse, while rooted in coincidence and folklore, amplified the significance of the discovery, ensuring that the Boy King would remain a figure of fascination for generations. Carter's meticulous scholarship preserved the material history, but the psychological and cultural resonance of the tomb ensured that its influence extended far beyond the Valley of the Kings. By the conclusion of this phase of work, it was clear that Tutankhamun's tomb was more than a site of archaeological importance. It had become a stage for human experience, a place where fear, wonder, and reverence intertwined. The Boy King, preserved in gold and linen, exerted a presence that challenged modern notions of mortality and the unknown. Carter's detailed records ensured that the physical artifacts would endure, but the legend, the sense of the tomb's power and the pharaoh's curse, remained unresolved. It was a reminder that history is never merely about the past. It is also about the stories we tell, the fears we project, and the fascination we feel when confronted with the unknowable. The legend of Tutankhamun's curse reached a new level of intensity as the months passed, fueled by coincidences, human imagination, and the global fascination with the Boy King. Reports of misfortunes continued to pour in from those who had visited the tomb, handled artifacts, or been associated with the excavation. Each new story, whether minor or dramatic, reinforced the perception that Tutankhamun's spirit was active, vigilant, and capable of exacting punishment. Even skeptics found it difficult to ignore the sheer number and consistency of reports. The pattern, whether real or imagined, seemed compelling enough to demand attention. The tomb had become more than an archaeological site. It was now a locus of mystery, myth, and psychological intrigue. Howard Carter continued his meticulous work, documenting the tomb with a combination of scientific precision and growing awareness of its psychological impact. Each day brought new artifacts to measure, sketch, and describe, from the gilded thrones to ceremonial weapons, from miniature statues of gods to intricately decorated jewelry. The treasures were staggering in both quantity and artistry, reflecting the Egyptians' obsession with death, the afterlife, and the preservation of identity. Carter's journals reveal his dual awareness. He understood the tangible, empirical value of his work, yet he could not ignore the intangible atmosphere that surrounded the tomb, the sense of presence that seemed to permeate the space. The Egyptian workers, crucial to the excavation's progress, were increasingly affected by the tomb's reputation. Some refused to enter certain chambers, performing protective rituals outside the tomb instead. Others whispered of strange phenomena, flickering shadows, faint sounds in empty corridors, or the sensation of being observed. Their cultural background and upbringing in the traditions of Egyptian superstition gave weight to these experiences. For them, the tomb was not simply a historical site. It was a sacred space, a bridge between the mortal and divine realms. Every action within its walls carried significance, and missteps were feared to invite consequences from beyond the grave. Beyond the site, the world remained captivated. Newspapers and periodicals printed sensational stories, each more dramatic than the last. A minor illness became proof of supernatural vengeance. An accident on the excavation site was attributed to the Boy King's wrath, and letters from readers claimed personal encounters with the curse. Spiritualists and occultists added layers of interpretation, arguing that Tutankhamun's tomb was not only a repository of treasure but a channel for ancient Egyptian magic, a force capable of punishing those who disturbed it. The narrative spread across continents, transforming the Boy King from a historical figure into a near-mythical presence who could influence the living. Even within the scholarly community, the tomb exerted influence. Some archaeologists approached with caution, aware of the psychological weight that stories of curses and misfortune carried. Others were drawn by the allure of danger, fascinated by the idea that interaction with the tomb could test both courage and curiosity. The perception of risk added drama to the work, creating an environment in which human behavior, fear, and superstition were as important as the artifacts themselves. Tutankhamun's tomb had become a stage where the interplay between history, psychology, and myth was as significant as the objects preserved within it. Carter's records reflected an acute awareness of this dual reality. He documented the artifacts with clinical precision, yet he also noted the human reactions to the tomb. Workers recoiled at shadows, torches flickered for no apparent reason, and whispers seemed to emanate from the walls. These observations, while empirical in tone, acknowledged the psychological and cultural significance of the tomb. It was a space where human perception, imagination, and the weight of history intersected, challenging the boundaries between objective reality and the intangible presence of the past. The treasures themselves reinforced the tomb's extraordinary aura. The golden funerary mask, with its serene and flawless expression, became a symbol of both the Boy King's majesty and the power attributed to him after death. Nested coffins, ceremonial beds, chariots, and countless smaller objects were arranged with precision to ensure Tutankhamun's journey into the afterlife. Every object had symbolic meaning, serving both ritual and protective purposes. To those present, the artifacts seemed almost animate, radiating authority, purpose, and a lingering presence that could not be ignored. The tomb was a space where art, ritual, and psychological impact converged seamlessly. Phenomena reported within the tomb continued to challenge rational explanation. Shadows seemed to move independently of light, faint scents of resin appeared spontaneously, and sudden chills defied the desert heat. Visitors described the sensation of unseen eyes tracking their movements, and some claimed to hear incomprehensible murmurs. Scientific explanations, drafts, fatigue, or environmental factors could account for some events, but the regularity of experiences across different individuals lent an eerie credibility to the legend. The tomb's influence was both psychological and cultural, a potent combination that amplified the mythos of the pharaoh's curse. Culturally, the discovery reshaped perceptions of ancient Egypt and the modern engagement with history. Tutankhamun's tomb illustrated the tension between human curiosity and respect for the past, knowledge and superstition, rationality and imagination. The legend of the curse, whether grounded in reality or not, enhanced the significance of the discovery, ensuring the Boy King's enduring place in global consciousness. The tomb became a narrative space, a crucible in which the past and present collided, generating awe, fear, and fascination in equal measure. By this stage, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb had transcended archaeology to become a legend. It was no longer just a site of discovery. It was a theater where human imagination, fear, and reverence were projected onto the artifacts and the Boy King himself. Carter's meticulous scholarship preserved the tangible reality of the tomb, but the intangible legacy, the perception of a presence, the psychological impact, and the myth of the curse, ensured that Tutankhamun would continue to captivate minds long after the physical excavation was complete. The tomb had become a story, a legend, and a cultural touchstone, demonstrating the enduring power of history to inspire awe and provoke fear. Even today, nearly a century later, Tutankhamun's tomb remains a symbol of the complex interplay between history, superstition, and human perception. The Boy King's presence, mediated through gold, ritual, and storytelling, continues to evoke fascination, a reminder that the past is never entirely silent and that the line between reality and myth can be as thin and fragile as a shadow in a tomb. Carter's work preserved the empirical truth, but the legend, the pharaoh's curse, the fear, and the fascination persisted, demonstrating the enduring human need to find meaning, mystery, and awe in the remnants of the past. The months following the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb saw an intensification of both fascination and fear, as the world grappled with the implications of disturbing a pharaoh who had been silent for over 3 millennia. Howard Carter, despite the frenzy surrounding him, remained devoted to his work, cataloging each artifact with painstaking care. Every measurement, sketch, and photograph was an act of preservation, ensuring that the treasures of the tomb could be studied long after their initial discovery. Yet, no matter how rational or methodical Carter remained, the atmosphere within the tomb seemed to assert a presence, a silent reminder that history was never inert but had a way of touching those who dared to intrude. Carter's daily routine had become a complex blend of scientific rigor and psychological endurance. He would enter the burial chamber early in the morning, moving carefully among the treasures to record their positions and details. The gilded sarcophagus, the golden mask, ceremonial chariots, thrones, and countless smaller objects. All were meticulously documented. But as he worked, he could not ignore the reactions of his team or the Egyptian workers, whose cultural and spiritual understanding of the tomb's significance added weight to every observation. Shadows flickered in torchlight, cool drafts appeared unexpectedly, and a faint, lingering scent of incense or resin seemed to hang in the air. Though Carter sought empirical explanations, he understood that these phenomena were shaping perceptions in profound ways. The Egyptian workers, whose labor had been essential to the excavation, approached the tomb with a combination of awe, fear, and respect. Many refused to enter the inner chambers, choosing instead to perform protective rituals outside. Small offerings, bread, fruit, and incense, were left at the entrances, and prayers were whispered to honor the Boy King and ward off any potential wrath. These actions were not merely superstition. They were an expression of a worldview in which tombs were sacred spaces, bridges between the mortal world and the afterlife. To violate these spaces lightly was to risk incurring divine judgment. As weeks passed, the workers' anxiety grew, and their stories of shadows, sudden chills, and faint whispers only added to the mythos surrounding the tomb. Beyond the Valley of the Kings, the world was captivated. Newspapers across Europe and America reported on the supposed curse with a mixture of sensationalism and fascination. Minor illnesses or accidents among those connected to the excavation were presented as evidence of supernatural retribution. Spiritualists claimed that Tutankhamun's spirit had been awakened, capable of reaching across time to punish those who disturbed his rest. Skeptics offered rational explanations: microbes, dust, environmental hazards, but these lacked the narrative drama that the idea of a vengeful pharaoh provided. The public, drawn to stories of mystery and fear, consumed every report, reinforcing the perception that the Boy King's tomb was more than a repository of artifacts. It was a locus of power and influence that extended into the present. Within the tomb, Carter's work revealed not just wealth, but the philosophy and ritual practice of the Egyptians. The treasures were arranged with purpose. Nested coffins, ceremonial beds, chariots, thrones, amulets, and jewelry all played roles in ensuring Tutankhamun's safe journey into the afterlife. Each object carried symbolic meaning, and their precise placement reflected centuries of religious and cultural practice. For the workers and visitors, the meticulous arrangement of these objects reinforced the sense of power and presence that seemed to radiate from the tomb. The Boy King's influence was encoded not only in gold and stone, but in the very spatial order of the tomb itself, a testament to the Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of death, ritual, and eternity. The tomb also had profound psychological effects on those who entered. Visitors reported sensations of being watched, sudden chills, and fleeting shadows in peripheral vision. Some claimed to hear faint whispers. Others felt an inexplicable heaviness or pressure in the air. Rational explanations, drafts, fatigue, and optical illusions were proposed. Yet the repetition and consistency of these experiences across multiple observers lent credence to the growing legend. The tomb had become a crucible, testing human perception, imagination, and courage. Even the most skeptical found themselves affected, confronted with a space where the past and present converged in ways that challenged understanding. As the story of the pharaoh's curse grew, it influenced not just public perception but the practice of archaeology itself. Scholars became more cautious, aware that the weight of superstition and the power of narrative could affect workers, funding, and public reception. Others were drawn to the site precisely because of its reputation, intrigued by the combination of danger, mystery, and the opportunity to witness history firsthand. Tutankhamun's tomb had become both a center of knowledge and a stage for human drama, illustrating the delicate balance between curiosity, respect, and fear. Carter meticulously documented not only the artifacts but also the reactions of those around him. He noted when workers hesitated at shadows, when torches flickered, and when subtle sounds seemed to emerge from empty corridors. These observations were recorded with clinical precision, yet they reveal the profound impact that the tomb had on human psychology. The tomb was a physical space, yes, but it was also a narrative space, a vessel for the projection of fears, beliefs, and expectations. It was a site where history, imagination, and perception intersected in ways that challenged the boundaries between the tangible and the intangible. The treasures themselves reinforced this impression. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, with its serene, almost otherworldly expression, became a focal point of awe. Every chest, statue, chariot, and piece of jewelry had been placed with deliberate intent, serving ritual, symbolic, and protective purposes. For those present, the objects seemed to emanate authority and presence, a silent communication of power that transcended time. The tomb was not merely a collection of artifacts. It was a carefully orchestrated environment in which the Boy King's essence appeared to persist, influencing perception, behavior, and imagination. The cumulative effect of the artifacts, the architecture, and the reported phenomena created a psychological landscape in which the tomb itself became an actor. It was a space where history exerted influence over the living, where the boundaries between reality and myth blurred. Visitors, workers, and scholars alike experienced a mixture of awe, fear, and fascination, compelled to acknowledge the Boy King's enduring presence. Carter's careful preservation of the artifacts ensured the survival of the physical record, but the psychological impact, the story, the myth, the fear was indelible. By the end of this stage of excavation, it was evident that Tutankhamun's tomb had transcended its material significance. It had become a narrative space, a site where human curiosity, reverence, and fear converged. The Boy King, preserved in gold and linen, exerted a presence that was as psychological as it was physical. Carter's work ensured that the tangible evidence would endure for generations, yet the intangible influence, the myth of the pharaoh's curse, the stories of misfortune, and the profound awe inspired by the tomb, ensured that Tutankhamun would remain a figure of fascination, mystery, and psychological power for centuries to come. The fame of Tutankhamun's tomb had by now reached a fever pitch, fueled not only by the extraordinary treasures within, but also by the growing legend of the pharaoh's curse. Stories of accidents, illnesses, and unexplained events continued to circulate, drawing the attention of the global public and igniting imaginations. Every minor misfortune among those connected to the excavation was interpreted as evidence that the Boy King's spirit had been disturbed, that the tomb itself carried an invisible power capable of reaching across the centuries. Newspapers printed sensational accounts, letters poured in from readers claiming personal experiences, and spiritualists claimed that ancient magic had been unleashed, all reinforcing the notion that Tutankhamun's tomb was more than a historical site. It was a locus of fear, awe, and mystery. Within the tomb, Howard Carter maintained his methodical focus, cataloging treasures with extraordinary precision. Every artifact, from the gilded sarcophagus and golden funerary mask to the chariots, ceremonial beds, amulets, and miniature statues, was recorded, photographed, and sketched. Carter's work ensured that the physical evidence of the tomb would endure for future study. Yet, even as he adhered to rigorous documentation, he was not impervious to the weight of the stories surrounding the site. The atmosphere inside the tomb remained charged. Shadows shifted subtly in torchlight, faint drafts appeared without cause, and the scent of resin lingered, as if the space itself remembered the Boy King's presence. The Egyptian workers, whose labor had been critical to the excavation, continued to express unease. Many refused to enter certain chambers, performing protective rituals outside the tomb. Offerings of bread, incense, and fruit were made, prayers whispered, and gestures of respect enacted to appease Tutankhamun's spirit. Some claimed that they saw fleeting movements of gold in the torchlight, or heard whispers in spaces that should have been silent. These experiences were shaped by deep-seated cultural beliefs, rooted in generations of reverence for the dead and the sanctity of tombs. For the workers, the tomb was not merely a repository of treasure, but a sacred space whose disturbance could invoke divine retribution. Outside the Valley of the Kings, the narrative of the curse flourished. Newspapers, magazines, and books sensationalized every story of misfortune, blending fact and embellishment to create a compelling mythology. Spiritualists claimed that Tutankhamun's spirit had been awakened, asserting the Boy King's ability to influence events across time. Skeptics suggested natural explanations, microbial infection, accidents, or coincidence, but the allure of the supernatural narrative proved irresistible to the public. The Boy King, once nearly forgotten, had been resurrected in the collective imagination, a figure whose authority and mystery extended far beyond the desert sands of Egypt. Within the excavation site, Carter continued to document the tomb with scientific rigor, balancing empirical observation with an acknowledgement of the psychological and cultural weight surrounding the discovery. He recorded not only the physical characteristics of each artifact but also the human responses to the tomb. Workers recoiled at shadows, torches flickered unexpectedly, and whispers seemed to emanate from the walls. Carter's journals reflect a disciplined observer aware of both tangible and intangible influences, the interaction of history, perception, and imagination in shaping the human experience of the tomb. The treasures themselves were more than material wealth. They were symbols of power, ritual, and belief. The golden mask, with its serene expression, seemed to radiate authority, while the nested coffins, chariots, and amulets reinforced the pharaoh's protection in the afterlife. Each object was placed with precise intent, reflecting centuries of religious and cultural knowledge. For those who entered the tomb, the artifacts carried an aura of presence and significance, a silent communication from the boy king that transcended time. Observers frequently described a sense of being watched, of the space itself asserting influence over their emotions and perceptions. The repeated accounts of unexplained phenomena, shifting shadows, sudden chills, and fleeting sounds, contributed to a perception of the tomb as a living, sentient space. Rational explanations could be proposed, from drafts and structural settling to fatigue and suggestion. Yet the consistency and intensity of these reports reinforced the legend of the pharaoh's curse. The tomb had become a psychological crucible, a space where human perception, fear, and imagination were as much at play as the physical artifacts themselves. Even the most skeptical visitors could not entirely dismiss the eerie atmosphere, nor the stories that surrounded the site. The cultural ramifications were profound. Tutankhamun's tomb reshaped the way the modern world viewed ancient Egypt, death, and archaeology. It highlighted the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition, rationality and imagination. The legend of the curse amplified the significance of the discovery, ensuring that the boy king's story would endure in global consciousness. The tomb became more than a site of scholarly interest. It was a space where human psychology, narrative, and history intersected, producing awe, fear, and fascination that transcended generations. Carter's meticulous work preserved the material reality of the tomb, but the legend of the pharaoh's curse became an inseparable part of the discovery. Each artifact, each shadow, and each subtle sensation contributed to a growing mythology that captivated the imagination. The tomb was both historical record and narrative device, a stage on which the past exerted influence over the present. Scholars, workers, and visitors alike were drawn into this interplay of observation, superstition, and human curiosity, participating in a story that extended far beyond gold and stone. By the conclusion of this stage of excavation, it was clear that Tutankhamun's tomb had achieved a dual significance. Materially, it was a treasure trove, an unparalleled record of a civilization's artistry and ritual. Psychologically and culturally, it was a space imbued with mystery, a crucible in which fear, awe, and imagination interacted with history. The boy king, preserved in gold and linen, exerted a presence that was as influential in narrative and myth as it was in tangible artifacts. Carter's careful preservation ensured the survival of the physical record, while the enduring perception of the curse guaranteed that Tutankhamun's legacy would persist not only in scholarly study, but in the collective imagination of the world. The tomb, in its intricate artistry, ritual complexity, and psychological impact, had become a symbol of the tension between human curiosity and the unknown. The pharaoh's curse, whether real or imagined, had transformed the discovery into a legend, a story of power, mystery, and the interplay between the living and the dead. Carter's work captured the empirical truth of the tomb, yet the legend persisted, a reminder that history is never solely about what is tangible. It is also about the fears, beliefs, and fascination that those who encounter it carry forward into the present and beyond. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had, by this point, transformed from a remarkable archaeological achievement into a cultural phenomenon that captivated the world. Every detail of the excavation, from the gilded sarcophagus to the smallest amulet, became part of a narrative that merged fact with legend. Stories of the pharaoh's curse dominated newspapers, periodicals, and personal letters, each tale amplifying the sense of mystery and danger surrounding the boy king's final resting place. The narrative was irresistible. A long-forgotten ruler, disturbed after millennia, exerting an invisible influence over the living. It was a story that transcended archaeology, appealing to the human fascination with the supernatural, the unknown, and the fragile line between life and death. Howard Carter, at the center of this maelstrom, remained dedicated to his work, meticulously cataloging, photographing, and measuring every artifact. The treasures of the tomb were staggering in both quantity and craftsmanship. Golden chariots, ceremonial thrones, intricately carved statues of gods, amulets, jewelry, and nested coffins, culminating in the golden funerary mask of the boy king. Each object was carefully positioned, reflecting the Egyptians' sophisticated understanding of ritual, death, and the afterlife. Carter's journals reveal not only his empirical attention to detail but also his awareness of the psychological weight the tomb exerted. The air seemed charged, shadows shifted in inexplicable ways, and a lingering scent of resin and incense suggested that the tomb itself retained the memory of the boy king. The Egyptian workers, whose labor had been indispensable to the excavation, experienced the tomb's presence in deeply personal ways. Many refused to enter certain chambers, performing protective rituals outside the tomb instead. Bread, fruit, and incense were offered, prayers whispered, and gestures of respect enacted, reflecting the belief that the space was sacred and that missteps could invite divine retribution. Reports of flickering shadows, cold drafts, and faint whispers circulated among the workers, adding to the atmosphere of awe and fear. Their cultural understanding of the tomb as a sacred space meant that every interaction carried weight, and each anomaly, however subtle, reinforced the perception that Tutankhamun's spirit remained present. Beyond the excavation site, the story of the pharaoh's curse spread like wildfire. Newspapers sensationalized minor accidents, illnesses, and misfortunes, attributing them to the boy king's wrath. Spiritualists and occultists offered their interpretations, claiming that ancient magic had been disturbed, while skeptics proposed rational explanations such as pathogens, fatigue, or coincidence. Yet the allure of a supernatural narrative proved irresistible to the public. Tutankhamun had become a figure of mythic proportions, his story intertwined with fear, fascination, and the imagination of millions who would never set foot in the Valley of the Kings. Even within the scholarly and archaeological communities, the tomb exerted influence. Researchers approached their work with a heightened sense of caution, aware that fear and superstition could affect worker morale, public perception, and the interpretation of findings. Some were drawn to the site precisely because of its reputation, intrigued by the idea of confronting the unknown firsthand. Tutankhamun's tomb had become both a center of knowledge and a stage for human drama, demonstrating that the study of history is never detached from the cultural and psychological forces that shape human experience. Carter's documentation reflects a careful balance between empirical observation and acknowledgement of these intangible forces. He recorded each object with precision, but he also noted the human reactions to the tomb, the hesitation of workers at shadows, the flickering of torches, the whispers that seemed to emerge from the walls. These accounts reveal the interplay between material reality and psychological perception. The tomb was not simply a repository of artifacts. It was a space in which history, myth, and human emotion intersected, influencing those who entered and shaping the stories they carried back to the wider world. The treasures themselves reinforced the sense of awe and mystery. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, with its serene expression and flawless craftsmanship, became an icon, representing not only the boy king's majesty but also the power attributed to him after death. Chariots, ceremonial beds, thrones, amulets, and small statues were all positioned with precise intent, forming a symbolic universe designed to guide and protect the pharaoh in the afterlife. For those who observed these artifacts, the meticulous care and spiritual significance imbued each object with a sense of authority and presence. The tomb was more than a collection of historical items. It was an environment carefully constructed to convey power, sanctity, and eternal influence. The repeated accounts of unexplainable phenomena contributed to the perception that the tomb was a living, sentient space. Visitors reported shadows moving independently of light, sudden cold drafts, faint murmurs, and an overwhelming sense of being observed. Scientific explanations could account for some occurrences, but the regularity and consistency of these experiences gave weight to the legend of the pharaoh's curse. The tomb had become a psychological crucible, testing not only perception but imagination, courage, and the human propensity to project meaning onto the unknown. Even the most skeptical individuals could not entirely escape the atmosphere of awe and apprehension. The broader cultural impact of Tutankhamun's tomb was profound. It reshaped perceptions of ancient Egypt, archaeology, and the relationship between the living and the dead. The narrative of the curse illustrated the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition, rationality and imagination. The discovery's sensational aspects amplified its significance, ensuring that Tutankhamun's story would persist in global consciousness. The tomb had become a narrative space where the past and present intersected, producing fear, wonder, and fascination in equal measure. By this stage, Tutankhamun's tomb had achieved dual significance. On one hand, it was an unparalleled archaeological achievement, providing an extraordinary record of a civilization's artistry, ritual, and understanding of the afterlife. On the other, it had become a story of psychological and cultural resonance, a space where human fear, awe, and imagination interacted with historical reality. Carter's careful preservation ensured the survival of the physical record, while the myth of the pharaoh's curse guaranteed that the boy king's legacy would endure, both as a historical figure and as a symbol of mystery, power, and the human fascination with the unknown. The tomb's influence extended beyond its immediate discovery, offering a lesson in the intersection of history, psychology, and culture. The pharaoh's curse, whether real or imagined, highlighted the human tendency to find meaning and narrative in the unknown, to project fears and desires onto the past, and to respond emotionally to artifacts that speak across centuries. Tutankhamun's tomb was a reminder that history is never merely a matter of facts. It is also a canvas upon which imagination, myth, and memory are painted, shaping perceptions and inspiring awe for generations to come. By the time Howard Carter reached the final stages of cataloging and documenting Tutankhamun's tomb, the world outside the Valley of the Kings had become utterly consumed by the legend of the pharaoh's curse. Every minor mishap, whether a sudden illness, a slip on uneven terrain, or the untimely death of someone associated with the excavation, was sensationalized as proof of the boy king's wrath. Newspapers in Europe and America eagerly reported these events, embellishing details to increase their dramatic impact. The stories captured the public imagination. Here was a pharaoh, long silent, exacting judgment from beyond the grave, punishing those who dared disturb his eternal resting place. The narrative was irresistible, and it fed on itself, growing more elaborate with each retelling. A potent mix of fact, coincidence, and human fascination with the supernatural. Carter, however, remained immersed in his meticulous work. Each artifact, no matter how small, was carefully measured, photographed, and recorded. The tomb's contents were staggering. Gilded chariots, ceremonial thrones, miniature statues, ritual implements, jewelry, and the nested coffins culminating in the golden funerary mask. Each object had been placed with exacting intent, reflecting the Egyptians' complex understanding of death, divinity, and the afterlife. Carter's journals reveal his acute awareness of the tangible and intangible dimensions of the tomb. The artifacts themselves, yes, but also the sense of presence, the subtle changes in temperature and air, the flicker of shadows, and the pervasive feeling that the boy king's influence lingered. The Egyptian workers continued to navigate the intersection of labor, reverence, and fear. Many refused to enter certain chambers, leaving offerings of bread, fruit, and incense outside, while whispering prayers to honor Tutankhamun and avoid his wrath. Reports of fleeting shadows, cold drafts, and faint whispers became more frequent, and the workers' anxiety heightened with each passing day. These experiences, grounded in a long cultural tradition of respect for the dead, gave the tomb an aura that transcended its material contents. To them, the space was not merely a repository of gold and stone, but a sacred place, where the boundary between life and death was thin and permeable. Outside the valley, the legend continued to spread, often detached from reality. Minor injuries or illnesses were interpreted as punishment, and spiritualists claimed that Tutankhamun's tomb had been imbued with ancient magic, capable of reaching across time to influence the living. Skeptics attempted to offer rational explanations: pathogens, drafts, structural settling, or coincidence. Yet the power of narrative, of fear mingled with wonder, proved far more compelling than logic. The boy king, once nearly forgotten, had become a mythic figure, his authority extending from antiquity into the modern imagination. His tomb was not just a historical site. It was a stage on which human fascination with the unknown, the sacred, and the dangerous could be projected. Carter, meanwhile, maintained his scientific discipline while acknowledging the psychological impact of the tomb. He recorded not only the physical attributes of each object but also the human responses to them. Workers flinched at shadows, torches flickered unpredictably, and faint, inexplicable noises were reported throughout the chambers. Carter's careful attention to both material and human dimensions illustrates the complex nature of the excavation. It was a space where history, myth, and perception converged. The tomb functioned as both a repository of the past and a catalyst for stories, fear, and imagination in the present. The treasures themselves were not merely material objects but symbols imbued with meaning. The golden mask, with its serene expression, represented the boy king's divine status and eternal protection. Chariots, thrones, amulets, and ceremonial beds were all positioned with precise intent, forming a symbolic universe to guide Tutankhamun through the afterlife. Each object radiated authority and presence, reinforcing the notion that the tomb itself was alive with ritual and power. Visitors and workers alike felt this presence, a subtle but persistent reminder that they were in a space constructed for eternity, where every artifact carried significance beyond its material form. The repeated reports of inexplicable phenomena only deepened the tomb's mystique. Shadows that seemed to move on their own, sudden cold drafts, faint murmurs, and the feeling of unseen eyes observing were commonly reported. While scientific explanations existed, air currents, human suggestion, and environmental factors, the regularity and intensity of these experiences gave the legend of the curse undeniable weight. The tomb had become a crucible for human perception, imagination, and emotion, a place where the tangible and intangible converged in ways that were difficult to separate or fully understand. Culturally, Tutankhamun's tomb transformed the modern understanding of ancient Egypt and the role of archaeology. It highlighted the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition, science and imagination. The pharaoh's curse, whether rooted in fact, coincidence, or cultural interpretation, amplified the significance of the discovery. The boy king's story became a lasting narrative, a legend that transcended the material artifacts to influence literature, popular culture, and collective consciousness. The tomb had become more than an archaeological site. It was a psychological and cultural phenomenon, a space where awe, fear, and fascination intertwined. By this stage, the dual significance of the tomb was unmistakable. Materially, it was an unparalleled record of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship, ritual, and belief. Psychologically and culturally, it was a vessel for storytelling, fear, and imagination. Carter's meticulous documentation ensured the survival of the physical record, while the legend of the pharaoh's curse guaranteed that Tutankhamun's legacy would endure not only in scholarly study but also in the popular imagination. The boy king had been resurrected, in a sense, through both the treasures of his tomb and the stories that humans projected onto them. The tomb's enduring influence reminds us that history is never purely about empirical facts. It is shaped as much by human perception, imagination, and narrative as by tangible artifacts. Tutankhamun's tomb demonstrates that the past can exert power over the present, that the unknown can inspire both awe and fear, and that legends, whether true or imagined, are an inseparable part of our understanding of history. Carter preserved the tomb with extraordinary care, but the story of the pharaoh's curse, the psychological weight of the space, and the fascination it inspired ensured that Tutankhamun would remain a figure of mystery and wonder for generations to come. As the months unfolded, the story of Tutankhamun's tomb continued to grow in both scale and intensity, reaching far beyond the confines of the Valley of the Kings. Howard Carter, immersed in the painstaking documentation of each artifact, remained acutely aware that the tomb was no longer merely a historical site. It had become a symbol, a story, and a psychological space where human perception, fear, and fascination converged. Every day presented a balance between rigorous scholarship and the recognition of the tomb's almost palpable presence, the weight of centuries pressing down on those who dared enter. Shadows seemed to move in the torchlight, the faint scent of resin lingered in the air, and a subtle chill hinted that this was no ordinary excavation. It was a confrontation with the past, and perhaps with something beyond it. Carter's work was exhaustive. He meticulously measured, sketched, and photographed every object, from the gilded sarcophagus and nested coffins to chariots, ceremonial thrones, and countless amulets and ritual implements. Each artifact was treated as a key to understanding not only the boy king's life and death, but also the complex religious and cultural beliefs that govern the afterlife in ancient Egypt. Carter's journals detail the precision of his methodology, but they also capture his awareness of the human dimension. The reactions of the workers, the subtle changes in the tomb's atmosphere, and the psychological tension created by the weight of history surrounding them. The Egyptian workers, essential to the excavation, continued to experience the tomb in deeply personal ways. Many refused to enter the inner chambers, performing protective rituals outside the tomb instead. Offerings of bread, fruit, and incense were placed at the entrances, prayers whispered to honor the boy king and avert his wrath. Stories of fleeting shadows, whispers, and sudden chills circulated among the laborers, reinforcing the sense that the tomb was more than a physical space. It was sacred, alive with the presence of a king whose influence extended beyond death. Their cultural understanding and reverence shaped their perceptions, ensuring that the excavation was as much a spiritual engagement as a scholarly one. Outside Egypt, the legend of the pharaoh's curse intensified, amplified by newspapers and periodicals eager for sensational stories. Minor accidents, illnesses, or sudden deaths among those connected to the excavation were presented as evidence of the boy king's vengeance. Spiritualists claimed that the tomb had unleashed a supernatural force, that Tutankhamun's spirit was active and capable of influencing the living. Skeptics offered rational explanations: pathogens, fatigue, environmental hazards, but the drama of the supernatural narrative proved far more compelling to the public. Tutankhamun, once nearly forgotten, had been resurrected in the collective imagination, a figure of mystery, awe, and fear. Within the tomb, Carter continued his dual role as both scholar and witness to the psychological impact of the space. He recorded not only the physical characteristics of each artifact but also the human reactions they provoked. Workers hesitated at shadows, torches flickered unexpectedly, and faint, unexplained noises seemed to emanate from the walls. These accounts highlight the interaction between material reality and human perception. The tomb was not merely a repository of objects, but a space in which the past exerted influence over the present, where history, myth, and imagination converged. The treasures themselves reinforced the tomb's extraordinary aura. The golden mask of Tutankhamun, with its serene, almost supernatural expression, became a symbol of both the boy king's majesty and the supposed power he exerted from beyond the grave. Chariots, ceremonial beds, thrones, amulets, and statues were all arranged with precise intent, forming a symbolic universe designed to guide and protect the pharaoh in the afterlife. For those present, these objects carried authority and presence, reinforcing the notion that they were in a sacred, constructed environment where every detail had significance. The tomb was as much an experiential space as a historical one, a place where perception and reality intertwined. Phenomena within the tomb continued to challenge rational explanation. Shadows appeared to move independently of light sources, sudden drafts caused unexpected chills, and faint murmurs seemed to echo through empty corridors. While scientific explanations, structural movement, drafts, and fatigue, could account for some events, the consistency and intensity of reports lent credibility to the growing myth. The tomb had become a psychological crucible, a site where human imagination, fear, and observation interacted with history in ways that were difficult to disentangle. Even skeptics could not escape the influence of the space, finding themselves affected by its atmosphere and by the stories that surrounded it. The cultural impact of Tutankhamun's tomb was profound. It reshaped modern understanding of ancient Egypt, archaeology, and the relationship between the living and the dead. The narrative of the pharaoh's curse illustrated the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition, and rationality and imagination. The discovery's sensational aspects amplified its significance, ensuring that the Boy King's story would endure in global consciousness. The tomb became more than an archaeological site. It became a story, a psychological landscape, and a cultural phenomenon in which awe, fear, and fascination converged. By this stage, the dual significance of the tomb was unmistakable. Materially, it provided an unparalleled record of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship, ritual, and belief. Psychologically and culturally, it served as a vessel for storytelling, fear, and human imagination. Carter's meticulous documentation preserved the tangible reality of the tomb, while the legend of the pharaoh's curse ensured that Tutankhamun's legacy would endure both as a historical figure and as a symbol of mystery, power, and the human fascination with the unknown. The Boy King had been resurrected through both his tomb's treasures and the narratives projected onto them by generations of humans. The tomb's influence demonstrated that history is never purely empirical. It is shaped by human perception, imagination, and narrative as much as by tangible artifacts. Tutankhamun's tomb illustrated that the past could exert power over the present, that the unknown could inspire awe and fear, and that legends, true or imagined, become inseparable from the understanding of history. Carter preserved the physical reality of the tomb with extraordinary care, but the psychological and cultural legacy, the story of the pharaoh's curse, and the fascination it inspired ensured that Tutankhamun would remain a figure of awe and mystery for generations to come. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had, by now, become a worldwide sensation, capturing the imagination of scholars, journalists, and the general public alike. Every artifact unearthed, from the golden funerary mask to the smallest amulet, became a story in itself, a testament to the Boy King's enduring presence and the grandeur of ancient Egyptian civilization. But alongside admiration and wonder grew fear and superstition. Tales of the pharaoh's curse proliferated with astonishing speed, each new story, an illness, an accident, or a sudden death, adding weight to the legend. Newspapers and periodicals across Europe and America reported these events with a mix of fact and dramatic embellishment, turning the narrative into a mythos that transcended the actual excavation. The Boy King, once forgotten, had been resurrected in popular imagination, a figure whose influence seemed to stretch from the sands of antiquity into the modern world. Howard Carter remained at the center of this whirlwind, balancing the responsibilities of meticulous scholarship with the weight of public expectation and the eerie atmosphere of the tomb. His daily routine involved detailed measurements, sketches, and photographs of every object, from chariots and ceremonial thrones to intricate jewelry and ritual statuettes. Carter's documentation ensured that the treasures could be studied for generations, but his journals also reveal an awareness of the psychological and cultural resonance of the tomb. He recorded the subtle ways in which shadows flickered in torchlight, the occasional inexplicable draft, and the faint, lingering scent of incense and resin, all of which contributed to the sense that the tomb itself was alive, a space where the past exerted pressure on the present. The Egyptian workers, whose labor was essential to the excavation, experienced the tomb as a space charged with spiritual significance. Many refused to enter certain chambers, choosing instead to perform protective rituals outside. Offerings of bread, fruit, and incense were left at key points, and prayers were whispered to honor Tutankhamun and ensure safety. Accounts of fleeting shadows, mysterious noises, and sudden chills were common, reflecting both genuine sensory experiences and the weight of cultural belief in the sanctity of tombs. To the workers, the tomb was not simply a site of historical discovery. It was a sacred space where intrusion could provoke consequences from the divine realm. Outside Egypt, the phenomenon of Tutankhamun's tomb became a cultural obsession. Newspapers reported minor accidents and illnesses as evidence of supernatural retribution, while spiritualists argued that the tomb had unleashed ancient magical forces. Skeptics offered natural explanations, from pathogens to environmental hazards, but the allure of the supernatural narrative captured the public imagination. The Boy King had transcended history to become a living presence in the modern psyche, a symbol of mystery, authority, and the unknown. His tomb was no longer just an archaeological site. It was a stage upon which human fascination with death, the sacred, and the extraordinary could play out. Carter's records reveal not only the meticulous cataloging of artifacts but also his awareness of the human experience within the tomb. Workers' reactions to shadows, the flicker of torches, and faint whispers were noted alongside precise measurements of golden chariots, ceremonial beds, amulets, and the nested coffins. This dual documentation reflects the complex interplay between material reality and human perception. The tomb was both a historical archive and a space of psychological resonance, a place where myth, history, and imagination intersected. Carter's approach preserved not only the physical objects but also a record of the human encounter with a space that seemed charged with invisible power. The treasures themselves were more than objects of beauty or craftsmanship. They were instruments of ritual, symbols of power, and reflections of a worldview that viewed death as a continuation of life. The golden funerary mask, serene and unyielding, represented Tutankhamun's divine protection, while the placement of chariots, thrones, amulets, and small statues reflected a meticulous attention to ritual significance. For those who entered the tomb, the arrangement and craftsmanship of the artifacts reinforced the perception of a commanding presence. The space was a deliberate orchestration of meaning, a constructed environment designed to communicate authority, sanctity, and eternal influence. Accounts of unexplained phenomena continued to accumulate, deepening the sense of mystery. Shadows appeared to move independently, unexpected drafts caused sudden chills, and faint sounds echoed through empty chambers. While rational explanations, air currents, structural shifts, or suggestion could account for some occurrences, the consistency and detail of multiple reports lent weight to the growing legend of the curse. The tomb had become a crucible for human perception, where the psychological and the physical converged. Even the most skeptical visitors found themselves affected by the atmosphere, confronted with the uncanny presence of a long-dead pharaoh whose story had transcended time. The cultural impact of Tutankhamun's tomb was profound and enduring. It reshaped perceptions of ancient Egypt, archaeology, and the interplay between the living and the dead. The pharaoh's curse, whether factual or mythologized, demonstrated the power of narrative, the human fascination with mortality, and the psychological resonance of history. The discovery's sensational elements amplified its significance, ensuring that Tutankhamun's story would remain in global consciousness for decades. The tomb became a space where awe, fear, and imagination intertwined, illustrating the complex relationship between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition. By this stage, the dual significance of Tutankhamun's tomb was undeniable. Materially, it represented an unparalleled archive of ancient Egyptian ritual, art, and belief. Psychologically and culturally, it had become a vessel for myth, storytelling, and human imagination. Carter's painstaking preservation ensured that the physical record would endure, while the legend of the pharaoh's curse ensured that Tutankhamun's presence would resonate in the popular imagination. The boy king had been resurrected not only through his treasures but through the narratives and fears projected onto them by those who encountered his tomb. The tomb's enduring influence demonstrates that history is never solely a matter of empirical fact. It is shaped equally by human perception, narrative, and imagination. Tutankhamun's story reminds us that the past can exert power over the present, that the unknown can inspire both awe and fear, and that legends, whether real, imagined, or a mixture of both, become inseparable from our understanding of history. Carter's work preserved the tangible reality, but the psychological and cultural resonance, the pharaoh's curse, the fascination it inspired, and the stories it generated, ensured that Tutankhamun would remain a figure of mystery, reverence, and enduring intrigue for generations to come. By the time the final chambers of Tutankhamun's tomb were being meticulously catalogued, the world outside the Valley of the Kings had become wholly enthralled by the tale of the pharaoh's curse. Reports of mysterious deaths, sudden illnesses, and minor accidents involving those connected to the excavation had captured headlines, giving the boy king a chilling posthumous presence in modern society. Newspapers, eager for sensational stories, chronicled each incident with dramatic flair, blurring the line between fact and legend. The public, spellbound by the possibility that an ancient ruler could exert influence across millennia, consumed these stories with insatiable curiosity. Tutankhamun had become a mythic figure, his story merging history, fear, and imagination into a compelling narrative that seemed to breathe as vividly as the treasures he left behind. Inside the tomb, Howard Carter continued his exacting work with unwavering focus. Every artifact, from gilded chariots and ceremonial thrones to miniature statues and amulets, was recorded with scrupulous care. Carter documented measurements, sketches, and photographs, creating a permanent record of the treasures and the spatial relationships that defined the tomb. Beyond the tangible, however, he was acutely aware of the tomb's psychological impact. Shadows seemed to shift independently of the flickering torchlight, faint drafts caused sudden chills, and subtle fragrances of resin or incense lingered inexplicably in the air. The tomb was not merely a historical site. It was an immersive experience in which history, ritual, and human perception converged. The Egyptian workers, whose labor was indispensable to the excavation, continued to experience the tomb as a profoundly spiritual space. Many refused to enter certain chambers, leaving offerings outside and whispering prayers to honor Tutankhamun and protect themselves from his alleged wrath. Tales of fleeting shadows, cold drafts, and whispers persisted, reinforcing the notion that the tomb was sacred, alive with the presence of the Boy King. Their deep cultural understanding of death and the afterlife shaped their behavior and perceptions, ensuring that every interaction with the tomb carried a weight beyond mere labor. To them, this was not just an archaeological project. It was a negotiation with the divine, a careful engagement with forces that could extend their influence far beyond the visible. Outside the valley, the legend of the pharaoh's curse intensified, fueled by sensationalist reporting and human fascination with the mysterious. Minor accidents or sudden illnesses were interpreted as evidence of the Boy King's supernatural power. Spiritualists argued that ancient Egyptian magic had been disturbed, releasing forces capable of influencing the living. Skeptics countered with rational explanations: microbes, fatigue, or pure coincidence. But the narrative of the supernatural proved irresistible. The Boy King, long forgotten in historical records, had been resurrected in popular imagination, a symbol of mystery, authority, and the enduring power of the past over the present. Carter's records reflect a careful balance between empirical documentation and acknowledgement of the tomb's intangible qualities. He not only catalogued the physical characteristics of every object but also noted the human responses they provoked. Workers hesitated at shadows, torches flickered without explanation, and faint sounds seemed to emanate from empty chambers. These accounts reveal the tomb as both a material repository and a psychological space, where history, mythology, and perception intersected. The excavation thus became more than a scholarly endeavor. It was an encounter with a past that exerted influence in ways both visible and invisible, a space in which human imagination and history converged. The treasures themselves reinforced the sense of awe and the perceived power of the tomb. The golden funerary mask, with its serene expression, symbolized Tutankhamun's divine protection and enduring majesty. Chariots, ceremonial beds, thrones, amulets, and statues were all arranged with careful intent, forming a universe designed to guide and protect the Boy King in the afterlife. For those who entered the tomb, these objects conveyed authority, presence, and significance. The spatial and symbolic arrangement created an environment in which the tomb itself seemed to communicate, a deliberate orchestration of meaning and ritual that imbued the space with perceived power. Accounts of unexplained phenomena within the tomb continued to accumulate, reinforcing its mystique. Shadows appeared to move independently of light, sudden chills swept through the chambers, and faint whispers echoed in empty spaces. While scientific explanations such as air currents, structural settling, and fatigue accounted for some events, the consistency of the reports lent credence to the growing legend. The tomb had become a crucible for human perception and imagination, a site where psychological and material realities interacted in ways that defied easy categorization. Even the most skeptical visitors were affected, confronted by the uncanny presence of a Boy King whose story had traversed thousands of years. The cultural impact of Tutankhamun's tomb was profound and lasting. It reshaped modern understanding of ancient Egypt, archaeology, and the human engagement with history. The legend of the pharaoh's curse illustrated the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition, science and imagination. Its sensational aspects amplified its significance, ensuring that Tutankhamun's story would endure in the global consciousness. The tomb became a psychological and cultural arena, where awe, fear, and fascination converged to create a narrative that was as compelling as the physical artifacts themselves. By this stage, the dual significance of the tomb was undeniable. On one hand, it represented an unparalleled archive of ancient Egyptian craftsmanship, religious ritual, and cultural belief. On the other, it had become a vessel for myth, storytelling, and human imagination. Carter's meticulous preservation ensured the survival of the physical record, while the legend of the pharaoh's curse guaranteed that Tutankhamun's presence would endure in both scholarly study and popular imagination. Through the treasures, the stories, and the fears projected onto them, the boy king had been resurrected, asserting influence far beyond his original era. The enduring impact of the tomb highlights the complex interplay between history, perception, and narrative. History is not solely the record of empirical fact. It is also shaped by human imagination, storytelling, and emotional engagement. Tutankhamun's tomb exemplifies how the past can exert power over the present, how the unknown can inspire awe and fear, and how legends, whether factual, imagined, or a combination of both, become inseparable from our understanding of history. Carter preserved the tangible reality of the tomb, but the pharaoh's curse, the fascination, fear, and stories surrounding it, ensured that Tutankhamun would remain a figure of mystery and reverence for generations to come. As the excavation of Tutankhamun's tomb reached its final stages, the intensity of public fascination only deepened. By now, the pharaoh's curse had taken on a life of its own, fueled by both sensational reporting and the compelling human attraction to mystery. Stories of misfortune, illness, and even death among those connected to the excavation were magnified, with newspapers presenting each incident as irrefutable proof that disturbing the boy king's tomb carried dire consequences. The legend transcended the boundaries of archaeology, merging with popular imagination and transforming Tutankhamun into a symbol of both awe and fear. His story no longer belonged solely to history. It had become a narrative that connected past and present in a web of suspense, superstition, and fascination. Inside the tomb, Howard Carter remained absorbed in his work, meticulously cataloging each artifact while noting the reactions of the Egyptian workers and the subtle, almost imperceptible anomalies of the space. Shadows flickered unpredictably, faint drafts whispered through the corridors, and the lingering scent of resin or incense added to the sense that the tomb itself was alive. The treasures, chariots, thrones, ceremonial beds, amulets, statues, and the golden funerary mask were not only objects of incredible craftsmanship, but also carefully arranged symbols of ritual and power. Every placement carried meaning, reinforcing the boy king's authority and his passage into the afterlife. For those who entered, the tomb was both a physical space and a psychological landscape, where history exerted influence in tangible and intangible ways. The workers' experiences further amplified the tomb's mystique. Many avoided the inner chambers entirely, leaving offerings and whispering prayers to honor Tutankhamun and ensure protection. Fleeting shadows, chilling drafts, and unexplained sounds were reported repeatedly, reflecting both genuine sensory experiences and the weight of cultural belief in the sanctity of tombs. These human reactions, combined with the tomb's treasures and the global narrative of the curse, transformed Tutankhamun's resting place into something far more than an archaeological site. It had become a stage on which the interplay of history, myth, and human psychology unfolded, ensuring that the boy king's presence would endure in both memory and imagination for generations to come. As the final artifacts were catalogued and carefully removed from Tutankhamun's tomb, the world remained captivated by the intertwined narratives of discovery and superstition. The story of the pharaoh's curse had by now become inseparable from the material reality of the tomb itself. Each new report of misfortune connected to the excavation, minor injuries, illnesses, or sudden deaths, was absorbed into the growing mythology, fueling both fear and fascination. Newspapers across continents printed sensational accounts, often emphasizing the supernatural at the expense of reason, while spiritualists and occultists offered their own interpretations of ancient magic unleashed. Tutankhamun had become a figure not only of historical interest but of mythic resonance, a boy king whose story transcended time and cultural boundaries, compelling audiences to wonder whether some force beyond human understanding had been disturbed by his tomb's opening. Within the tomb, Howard Carter's focus remained unwavering. He continued to document the treasures with scrupulous precision, noting the position, condition, and symbolic significance of each object. Chariots, thrones, ceremonial beds, amulets, and statues were all meticulously recorded, reflecting the ancient Egyptians' complex understanding of death and the afterlife. Carter's observations extended beyond mere artifacts. He also documented the subtle, uncanny experiences of those who entered the tomb. Flickering shadows, sudden chills, faint whispers, and the lingering scent of resin or incense were noted repeatedly, underscoring the psychological weight of the space. The tomb had become a site where the tangible and intangible coexisted, a place in which human perception, cultural belief, and the physical environment converged. The Egyptian workers, whose labor had been essential, continued to navigate a delicate balance of respect, fear, and duty. Many avoided the inner chambers entirely, leaving offerings of bread, fruit, and incense while whispering prayers to honor Tutankhamun and seek protection from any spiritual retribution. Their experiences, informed by centuries of cultural and religious tradition, reinforced the tomb's sacred status and contributed to the legend of the curse. The excavation thus became not merely an act of discovery but a profound encounter with the past, a space where awe, reverence, and imagination converged, ensuring that Tutankhamun's presence would resonate long after the physical artifacts were removed. As the dust settled around the Valley of the Kings and the treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb were carefully transported to museums and secure storage, the legend of the pharaoh's curse had taken on a life of its own. The world had witnessed not only an extraordinary archaeological discovery, but also the unfolding of a narrative that blurred the line between history and myth, fact and imagination. Howard Carter's meticulous work ensured that the physical reality of the tomb, its artifacts, spatial arrangement, and ritual significance, would be preserved for generations. Yet the stories surrounding the discovery had already entered popular consciousness in ways that no document or photograph could contain. The tomb had become a nexus of fascination, fear, and awe, a space where the boy king's presence seemed to extend across millennia, exerting influence both tangible and psychological. Carter's journals, painstakingly detailed, reveal a man fully aware of the delicate balance between empirical scholarship and the human response to the extraordinary. Each object was measured, sketched, and photographed with precision, from the golden mask that had become an icon of ancient Egyptian art to the smallest amulet that bore ritual significance. He recorded not only the artifacts but also the subtle phenomena reported by workers and visitors. Shadows that shifted inexplicably, sudden chills that swept through chambers, faint whispers in spaces that should have been silent. These observations highlight a critical dimension of the tomb. It was not merely a repository of material wealth but a psychological environment that shaped perception, fear, and imagination. Carter understood that history was not experienced solely through artifacts. It was felt, intuited, and interpreted by those who encountered it. The Egyptian workers, whose labor had been essential to the excavation, experienced the tomb as a profoundly spiritual space. Many refused to enter certain chambers, performing protective rituals outside while leaving offerings of bread, fruit, and incense. Prayers were whispered, gestures of respect enacted, and stories of fleeting shadows and sudden drafts circulated widely. These experiences were shaped by deeply held cultural and religious beliefs, which regarded tombs as sacred spaces where the boundary between life and death was permeable. To the workers, every step inside the tomb was an act of negotiation with the divine, a careful acknowledgement of forces that could extend their influence beyond the visible world. Their engagement with the space was not mere labor. It was a communion with history and spirituality, an interaction that infused the excavation with layers of meaning beyond the material artifacts. Meanwhile, the legend of the pharaoh's curse had transcended the confines of the Valley of the Kings. Reports of misfortune among those connected to the excavation, whether real, coincidental, or exaggerated, were amplified by newspapers, journals, and later books, creating a global narrative of supernatural retribution. Spiritualists and occultists asserted that ancient magic had been disturbed, that the Boy King's spirit had awakened, and that the tomb itself was an active agent of judgment. Skeptics proposed natural explanations, pathogens, accidents, fatigue, but these rational accounts often failed to capture public imagination. The story of Tutankhamun had become a myth, a narrative framework through which people could explore the intersection of history, mortality, and the unknown. The Boy King, once nearly forgotten, had been resurrected in collective consciousness, his presence extending far beyond the golden walls of his tomb. Carter's careful documentation of the tomb's treasures reinforced the physical reality of the discovery, but the psychological and cultural impact was equally profound. The golden mask, with its serene, almost divine expression, symbolized not only the Boy King's status in life and death, but also the authority and continuity of a civilization whose rituals and beliefs had endured for millennia. Chariots, thrones, ceremonial beds, statues, and countless amulets were positioned with precise intent, forming a symbolic universe designed to guide and protect Tutankhamun in the afterlife. Each artifact was more than a historical object. It was a message, a carefully constructed expression of power, sanctity, and immortality. Observers often reported a sense of being watched, of an invisible presence that communicated through objects in space. The tomb was thus both material and metaphysical, a place where human imagination, cultural belief, and empirical observation intersected in ways that were difficult to disentangle. The accumulation of unexplained phenomena, shadows, drafts, faint whispers, reinforced the legend of the pharaoh's curse. While scientific explanations could account for some occurrences, the consistency of the reports across workers, visitors, and journalists lent credibility to the growing mythology. The tomb functioned as a crucible in which perception, imagination, and history converged. Even the most skeptical visitors could not entirely escape the psychological power of the space. The artifacts, the arrangements, and the atmosphere created a narrative in which the past exerted influence over the present, a reminder that human engagement with history is as much about experience and interpretation as it is about empirical fact. The cultural ramifications of Tutankhamun's tomb extended far beyond archaeology. It reshaped the modern understanding of ancient Egypt, illuminating its artistry, ritual, and worldview in unprecedented detail. It also demonstrated the tension between curiosity and respect, knowledge and superstition, science and imagination. The legend of the pharaoh's curse, whether factual or imagined, amplified the significance of the discovery, ensuring that Tutankhamun's story would persist in the global consciousness. The tomb had become a narrative space, a psychological landscape, and a cultural phenomenon all at once, where awe, fear, and fascination intertwined. It illustrated that human interaction with history is never purely rational. It is colored by imagination, emotion, and narrative interpretation. In this duality, the material and the mythic, the legacy of Tutankhamun endures. The artifacts preserve the tangible evidence of a civilization's sophistication, its rituals, and its artistry. Simultaneously, the story of the pharaoh's curse preserves the intangible, the human response to encountering something extraordinary, the projection of fear and reverence onto history itself. Carter's work ensured that scholars could study the Boy King's treasures for generations, but the myth ensured that the public imagination would remain captivated, bridging millennia with a story that is at once historical, psychological, and spiritual. The tomb's influence demonstrates that history is never merely a record of objects and dates. It is also shaped by human perception, cultural belief, narrative, and imagination. Tutankhamun's story shows how the past can exert a profound influence on the present, inspiring awe, fear, and reflection. The pharaoh's curse, whether real, imagined, or somewhere in between, ensured that the Boy King's presence would endure, not only in museums and scholarly texts but in the collective consciousness of humanity. The interplay of fact and legend, tangible and intangible, reality and myth, has made Tutankhamun a symbol of the enduring power of history to captivate, challenge, and inspire. Ultimately, the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb and the legend of the pharaoh's curse invites reflection on our relationship with the past. What does it mean to disturb what has been preserved for thousands of years? How do we reconcile empirical knowledge with human emotion, imagination, and superstition? The Boy King's tomb reminds us that history is never passive. It is alive in our perceptions, shaped by our fears, fascinations, and reverence. Tutankhamun, through both his treasures and the stories they inspired, continues to speak across time, inviting each generation to encounter, interpret, and wonder at a civilization whose mysteries remain as compelling today as they were nearly a century ago.